What if the greatest secrets of the British Empire were never written in history books, but buried beneath them? Across centuries, the British Empire stretched its influence over a quarter of the Earth's surface. It built railways across deserts, drew borders with rulers, and carved its legacy into the bones of continents. But within its rise, behind the power, the progress, and the polished portraits, are shadows few dare to examine. Whispers of vanished expeditions in the Himalayas, cryptic symbols etched into colonial fortresses, a ship that arrived home without its crew. These are not legends. They're fragments of real events, omitted from the headlines, yet preserved in the corners of old archives and forgotten journals. Were they oversights, or something deliberately left unsaid? Tonight, we pull back the curtain on the hidden history of the British Empire. Not the victories you've heard, but the mysteries you were never meant to. So sit back, relax, and let's dive into a world of intrigue, empire, and secrets lost to time. Beneath the soft drizzle of a Dublin morning, the imposing facade of Dublin Castle stands quiet, its stone walls bearing centuries of whispers. Within its chambers, where power once concentrated under the gaze of kings and colonial authority, a story lingers, one of prestige, betrayal, and disappearance. It is here, in the heart of what was once British rule in Ireland, that the Irish crown jewels vanished without a trace. These were not the coronation treasures of a monarch, as the name might suggest. The so-called Irish crown jewels referred to the regalia of the most illustrious order of St. Patrick, an order of chivalry created by King George III in 1783. Their centerpiece was a star and badge made of gold and silver, adorned with nearly 400 precious stones, Brazilian diamonds, rubies, and emeralds set into intricate patterns. At their core, the sparkling insignia bore a cross of St. Patrick, a symbol of Ireland's contested identity, wrapped in empire, nobility, and spectacle. The regalia were meant to dazzle. They were worn by the Lord Lieutenant of Ireland during formal ceremonies, most notably the installation of knights into the order. By the early 20th century, the Irish crown jewels were housed in a specially designed safe kept within the Bedford Tower of Dublin Castle. Yet on July 6, 1907, just days before they were to be used in an official ceremony, they were discovered missing. The doors had not been forced. There were no signs of struggle. No alarms were raised in the night. The safe that held the jewels, custom-built and double-locked, had not been broken into, because it had simply been opened. The jewels had vanished from the most secure building in Ireland. The initial investigation was swift but unsatisfying. At the center of suspicion stood Sir Arthur Vickers, the Ulster King of Arms, who had charge of the regalia. Known for his fondness for drink and eccentric behavior, Vickers quickly became the scapegoat of public outrage. He claimed he had been framed. He refused to resign. He demanded an open inquiry. But the inquiry, when it came, was conducted behind closed doors, and its findings were never made public. To this day, the original report remains sealed. Why? What was so damaging, so dangerous, that the truth of a stolen set of ceremonial jewels needed to be suppressed? Some believed Vickers had been negligent. Perhaps he'd allowed unauthorized access to the keys, or even drunkenly left the safe open. Others whispered of a scandal far more serious. Among the names that surfaced in hushed tones was that of Captain Richard Gorges, a decorated soldier with a reputation for charisma and violence. He was close to Vickers and had access to the same rooms within the castle. Rumors circulated that Gorges may have used his influence to gain entry to the safe. He was later implicated in blackmail, forgery, and even murder. Yet no charges were ever filed in connection with the jewels. There were suggestions of a cover-up, not just of theft, but of a scandal that could shake the foundations of British rule in Ireland. One of the more persistent theories involved secret homosexual liaisons within the castle's upper ranks, a subject considered taboo and ruinous in Edwardian society. Could the jewels have been stolen to silence or blackmail officials, or to prevent public exposure? This theory was never proven, but neither was it disproven. And the silence of official records only deepened suspicion. Then came the political speculation. In the years leading up to the theft, Ireland was a land of tension. Nationalist fervor, secret organizations, and growing calls for independence. Some believed the jewels had been stolen by Irish Republicans to embarrass the crown or to fund future uprisings. Yet no such group ever claimed responsibility. And the jewels, so recognizably unique and lavish, were never seen on the black market. Was this the work of master thieves, or something closer to home? Fringe theories expanded from the political to the surreal. One claimed the jewels were hidden in a private estate, passed down quietly through an aristocratic family who dare not sell them. Another suggested they were shipped abroad, perhaps to America or continental Europe, melted down to erase their identity. Some even proposed that they were never stolen at all, but mislaid, and that someone, somewhere, might still have them, locked in an attic, not knowing what lies inside the box. There's also the unnerving possibility of official complicity. If someone high within the British administration was involved, whether through negligence, conspiracy, or corruption, what motive might the Crown have had to bury the truth? Could it have been a calculated decision to avoid further unrest in an already volatile Ireland? The lack of transparency in the investigation has led some to believe that the real story was never meant to be found. In 1912, 5 years after the theft, Vickers published a defiant pamphlet declaring his innocence. He named names, accused his accusers, and died still denying any wrongdoing. During the Irish War of Independence, he was killed by the IRA, shot in his home for alleged collaboration with the British. Whether this had any connection to the missing jewels is unknown. Over a century later, the Irish crown jewels remain lost. No ransom note, no confirmed sighting, no resolution. Today, tourists walk the halls of Dublin Castle, unaware that one of the greatest unsolved thefts in British and Irish history unfolded just meters away. The safe still exists. The questions still echo. Were they stolen in a moment of opportunism or as part of a grander plan? And if the truth lies in sealed documents and forgotten rooms, will it ever be uncovered? Or are the Irish crown jewels destined to remain a glittering ghost, shimmering forever just out of reach? As we leave behind the lost glitter of the Irish crown jewels, we shift to a quieter, more recent enigma. One not of stolen regalia, but of a vanished man. A story that unfolds not in the echoing halls of a castle, but along the quiet streets of Belgravia, one of London's most exclusive districts. It was here, at 46 Lower Belgrave Street, behind the stoic white facade of a Georgian townhouse, that something unthinkable occurred on the night of November 7, 1974. The home belonged to Veronica Lucan, estranged wife of Richard John Bingham, the 7th Earl of Lucan, a man born into privilege, educated at Eton, polished by the Royal Guards, and once considered for the role of James Bond due to his aristocratic charm. Lord Lucan was a man of refinement and reputation, known for his tailored suits, his penchant for Aston Martins, and his compulsive gambling. But that night, whatever he had been, he became something else entirely. Shortly after 9 p.m., Veronica Lucan burst into a nearby pub, bloodied, shaken, and gasping that her husband had tried to kill her. Inside her home, the body of Sandra Rivet, the family's 29-year-old nanny, lay bludgeoned to death in the basement. Veronica would later claim that Lucan had mistaken Sandra for her, that he had attacked the wrong woman. But Lord Lucan was nowhere to be found. His car, a Ford Corsair, was discovered hours later in the coastal town of New Haven. Inside were bloodstains, a piece of piping, and the scent of uncertainty. The car had been abandoned near the English Channel, as if, perhaps, he had fled by boat, or planned to vanish beneath the waves. And then, nothing. No confirmed sightings, no letters, no body. A British aristocrat accused of murder had simply vanished, leaving behind a bloodied crime scene, a shattered family, and a mystery that would stretch on for decades. The investigation began immediately. A nationwide manhunt was launched, and Lord Lucan became the first member of the House of Lords to be named a murder suspect in over a century. Yet, despite immense media coverage and international attention, no definitive trace of him was ever found. Over the years, sightings were reported across the globe. Australia, South Africa, India, even Paraguay. Each new tip sparked renewed interest, but none were confirmed. Some were cases of mistaken identity, others perhaps were deliberate fabrications. What made the case so enduring was not only the mystery of Lucan's disappearance, but the air of conspiracy that seemed to cling to it. Lucan was not a solitary figure. He moved in elite circles, friends with aristocrats, bankers, even royalty. Some believed he had help escaping, that his friends in high places orchestrated his exit, offering him sanctuary in private estates or foreign enclaves where questions were few and records non-existent. Could a man really disappear so cleanly, so permanently, without powerful assistance? Then came the more disturbing theories. One suggestion was that Lucan had never left the country at all, that he had been killed by the same friends who feared what he might reveal if arrested. His body, some said, was fed to tigers in a private zoo owned by one of his acquaintances. It sounds outlandish, and yet it was quietly repeated in the years following his disappearance. Others speculated that he had taken his own life shortly after fleeing, overcome with guilt or despair. The English Channel, just miles from where his car was found, is a cold, vast grave, deep enough to swallow both man and truth. But no body ever surfaced, and the sea does not always keep secrets forever. The more conspiratorial voices went further still. Some claimed Lucan was given a new identity by British intelligence, that he had performed clandestine work in the past, and his disappearance was part of a larger classified operation. There's no hard evidence of this, but in a case where silence has outlived evidence, speculation fills the void. Even official attempts to resolve the mystery failed to bring closure. In 1999, Lord Lucan was declared legally dead, but it wasn't until 2016, over 40 years after the murder, that he was issued a formal death certificate, allowing his son to inherit the family title. Yet to many, the paperwork meant little. It answered no questions. It offered no proof. In the decades since, the Lucan mystery has become part of British folklore, a ghost story dressed in Savile Row suits. He has been portrayed in films, examined in books, and dissected in tabloids. But despite the scrutiny, the case remains frustratingly opaque. Why did he attack that night? Was it premeditated murder or a tragically mistaken identity? Did he act alone, or was someone else involved? Did he escape with help or vanish alone into the dark? And perhaps the most haunting question of all, was Lord Lucan ever truly gone? Some believe he lived out his years in anonymity, quietly watching the world search for him while he hid in plain sight. Others suggest the mystery was never meant to be solved, that those who know the truth made certain it stayed hidden. Even now, the image persists. A tall, elegant man with a cigarette in hand and a shadow over his past, vanishing into the cold fog of a November night. No trace, no closure, just a lingering absence. The door remains open, not just to possibility, but to wonder. Where did Lord Lucan go? And who still knows the answer? As we continue our journey through the overlooked enigmas of the British Empire, we find that sometimes it's not objects or places that vanish, but people and the truth they carry with them. As the fog of the Lord Lucan mystery fades into the shadows of London's backstreets, our path now leads us to a very different kind of vanishing, one that occurred not in the drawing rooms of Britain, but on a sun-scorched hillside thousands of miles away. A place where empire met resistance, and where, it is said, an entire battalion simply disappeared. Welcome to Gallipoli. The peninsula juts into the Aegean Sea like a crooked finger, dry and stony, where olive trees cling to thin soil and gulls wheel endlessly above the cliffs. In 1915, these now quiet slopes were a crucible of war. Here, during the First World War, British and Allied forces launched a campaign against the Ottoman Empire, an attempt to seize control of the Dardanelles and open a new front against Germany. It was a campaign soaked in miscalculation and blood. Over 100,000 men would die on this narrow strip of land. But among all the tragedies and missteps, one event stands apart, not for its scale but for its eerie silence. The vanishing of the 1/5th Battalion, Norfolk Regiment. A story both recorded and doubted. A disappearance that has never been fully explained. It was August 12, 1915. The heat was punishing, and the land around the village of Anafarta was choked with thorny scrub and dust. The 1/5th Norfolks, part of the larger Sandringham Company, had been ordered to advance inland from Suvla Bay. These were not battle-hardened regulars. Many were estate workers and servants from the royal household at Sandringham, handpicked by King George V's own land agent. They had come to serve their country, and now found themselves in the fire of a brutal and disorganized offensive. According to official reports, the Norfolks pressed forward with courage. They were last seen moving into a grove of trees, chasing retreating Ottoman forces, but they never came out. When the smoke cleared, the company had vanished. Not fallen, not captured, simply gone. When the ground was retaken weeks later, no mass graves were found, no wounded, no prisoners, just silence. How could over 250 men disappear into thin air in the middle of a battlefield? The British War Office offered only speculation. Cut off, killed in action, bodies lost in the chaos. Yet in 1918, an extraordinary claim surfaced. 3 members of the New Zealand Field Company swore an oath to what they had seen. According to their testimony, they observed a strange, low-hanging cloud, an olive-colored fog, hovering just above the ground where the Norfolks had advanced. The soldiers, they said, marched into it without hesitation, and the cloud then rose slowly into the sky, taking the men with it. This account was submitted in 1965 to the British Ministry of Defense, and later appeared in books exploring battlefield anomalies and military disappearances. Naturally, skeptics dismissed it. Fog banks are common in coastal areas. Battlefield confusion can spawn myths. But what if there was more to it? Mainstream historians have pointed to more grounded explanations. Some believe the battalion pressed too far ahead of the main force, becoming surrounded and overwhelmed. Ottoman records from the time indicate a fierce counterattack in the same area. It's possible the men were killed, their bodies scattered and decomposed beyond recognition in the searing heat. And yet, even the Ottoman accounts make no direct mention of capturing or eliminating a unit of that specific size. Turkish sources, too, are oddly vague on what happened during that exact window of time. Then there are the theories that lie further from the accepted narrative. Some believe the cloud was a chemical weapon, perhaps deployed accidentally by one side or the other, causing mass disorientation or death without leaving the usual signs of combat. However, there is no confirmed use of such agents at Gallipoli, and the conditions for deployment would have been questionable at best. Others, more fringe but persistent, suggest the possibility of a secret weapon or experimental device, something buried by wartime censorship and never acknowledged. Could this have been a cover-up of some sort? An error that needed to be erased? And still, some embrace the stranger tales. Theories of time slips, of strange atmospheric phenomena, even of alien intervention have appeared in speculative writings over the years, though they exist more as cultural reflections of our need to explain the inexplicable than as serious historical claims. But even within the grounded boundaries of military history, the questions persist. The mystery of the Norfolk Battalion doesn't hinge on fantasy, but on absence, the absence of evidence, the absence of explanation. In 1919, a battlefield burial party found the remains of 180 men in a shallow grave near Anafarta. Some wore Norfolk badges, others were never identified. The location, however, did not match where the battalion was last reported seen, and it did not account for the entire unit. Were these the missing men, at last? Or just more shadows among many in the fog of Gallipoli? Today, a plaque in the Sandringham Estate Church remembers the men of the 1/5 Norfolks. Their names etched in stone, their story passed down through generations. But their final moments remain a riddle. In the quiet hills of Gallipoli, among dry earth and crumbling trenches, there is no monument for what cannot be proven, only questions carried on the wind. Did the Norfolks die bravely, lost to the chaos of battle? Were they victims of a wartime mistake buried by bureaucracy? Or does their story hide something stranger still, something history has yet to uncover? The Empire once sought to write its destiny in maps and medals, but sometimes even it could not hold on to its own men. And as we continue our journey through the forgotten and the unexplained, we are reminded that some mysteries don't just linger, they echo. From the battlefield haze of Gallipoli, where the Norfolk Battalion marched into legend, we turn now to a different kind of disappearance, one not of soldiers or battalions, but of words, private thoughts, coded intentions, letters that may have held the true heart of an enigma called T.E. Lawrence. The desert wind whispers through the ruins of Aqaba and Petra, skimming over stone like a voice remembered but not understood. This is the land Lawrence of Arabia came to know better than his own country, harsh, vast, and unsparingly beautiful. By the early 20th century, the young British archaeologist turned soldier had transformed himself into a myth. A man who wore Arab robes and led Bedouin warriors against the Ottoman Empire during the First World War. A scholar, a spy, a rebel, and possibly something more. But behind the legend lies a quieter trail, a paper trail, letters, hundreds of them, some public, some private, some packed with tactical brilliance and others threaded with vulnerability. Many of these letters have been studied, archived, and published, yet not all of them, because some of Lawrence's letters, perhaps the most revealing, are missing, and no one truly knows why. Lawrence was a prolific correspondent. He wrote constantly, to family, to friends, to military superiors, politicians, and journalists. He documented his own story meticulously. It's one of the reasons we know so much about him. 7 Pillars of Wisdom, his famed memoir, was born out of this compulsive need to record and reinterpret. But Lawrence also knew how to erase. After the war, he destroyed many of his personal papers. Some were burned at his request. Others, he claimed, were lost accidentally. But were they? Or were these omissions calculated? Among the most tantalizing absences are several letters Lawrence wrote, or was said to have written, during and immediately after the Arab Revolt. Correspondence sent to high-ranking British officers, Arab leaders, and even individuals in Paris during the treaty negotiations of 1919. Letters that may have contained his candid thoughts on the betrayal of Arab independence. According to a few of his contemporaries, These letters included explicit criticisms of British and French policy in the Middle East, warnings that promises made to Arab allies were being quietly dismantled behind closed doors. Some claim Lawrence documented conversations with Emir Faisal, with Winston Churchill, even with American representatives, notes that would have revealed a deep internal conflict between his loyalty to Britain and his sympathy for Arab self-determination. But these letters, if they ever existed, are nowhere to be found. The mainstream explanation? Lost to time, wartime chaos, bureaucratic mishandling, private collectors. It wouldn't be unusual. Many documents from that era have vanished into private archives, misfiled or destroyed by routine neglect. But some historians are not so certain, because over the years, fragmentary references to these letters have surfaced in diaries, memoirs, and third-party testimonies. A line here, a citation there. In some cases, quotations appear in older books or official documents, yet the original source cannot be found. One particularly strange example emerged in the 1950s, when a former intelligence officer hinted that Lawrence had corresponded with a Zionist organization in secret. No letter has ever surfaced, and no recipient has verified it. But even the possibility suggests layers of diplomacy and personal conviction we have yet to fully understand. Could these letters have been classified, deliberately buried by the British government to protect national interests in the fracturing Middle East? Or did Lawrence himself orchestrate their removal, shielding his allies or perhaps his own legacy? And then there are the more speculative theories. Some believe the missing letters included details of covert operations, unsanctioned actions during the war that Lawrence carried out without official orders. If true, they might have implicated not just Lawrence, but British involvement in politically volatile campaigns. Others suggest that Lawrence, who struggled deeply with fame and inner conflict, may have written things he later regretted. Confessions, perhaps, about the cost of his actions. Personal admissions that challenged the public image he had come to despise. After all, he once wrote, "I gave my body to be burned, and my soul to be trodden on." In more fringe corners of the theory landscape, some have even proposed that a false version of Lawrence's story was carefully curated by government hands or by Lawrence himself to shape imperial memory. That the missing letters, if ever uncovered, would force a reassessment not just of Lawrence, but of Britain's entire role in redrawing the map of the modern Middle East. There is no hard proof of this, only silence. Today, the fragments we do have of Lawrence's life still pulse with contradiction. He was a servant of empire who despised imperial hypocrisy, a warrior who longed for peace, a man who could command revolts by day and retreat into obscurity by night. In 1935, he died suddenly, struck by a motorcycle accident on a narrow Dorset road. Some called it fate. Others quietly suggested something more deliberate, an accident too convenient, a death too timely, just as war was once again stirring in Europe. If the missing letters still exist, if they survived fire and war and bureaucracy, where are they now? Hidden in a private estate? Locked in a government archive under seal? Forgotten in a dusty attic somewhere, waiting to be found? And if they are found, what might they say? Do they reveal Lawrence as a reluctant hero caught between two worlds? Or do they expose a deeper, darker truth about how empires are built, and what must be silenced to hold them together? As we journey further into the shadows of the British Empire, we find again and again that what is unwritten often speaks loudest. And sometimes the silence of a missing letter tells us more than the words it once carried. As we leave behind the windswept ruins and lost correspondence of Lawrence of Arabia, our attention turns to an object, not a person. An object both dazzling and dark, shrouded in grandeur, bloodshed, and whispers. Nestled behind bulletproof glass in the Tower of London, beneath the watchful eye of yeoman guards and centuries of empire, rests a diamond of almost supernatural fame, the Koh-i-Noor, literally mountain of light. It sparkles with unmatched clarity, 105 carats of cold brilliance, part of the British crown jewels set into the Queen Mother's crown. But it is not the stone itself that holds our focus. Rather, it is what once accompanied it, a set of ancient warnings, legends, and curses, now mysteriously missing. For centuries, the Koh-i-Noor was believed to bring fortune only to women and ruin to the men who dared to wear it. The diamond's history is littered with the rise and fall of empires, with dynasties cut short, rulers betrayed, and cities burned. And at the center of that history was a prophecy, a written curse said to be passed down with the stone. And now that text is gone. The known history of the Koh-i-Noor begins in the Indian subcontinent, though its true origins vanish into the mists of time. Some scholars trace it back over 2,000 years, perhaps even earlier, mined from the famed Koh-i-Noor mines in the Golconda region. It changed hands repeatedly, often through conquest and bloodshed. The Mughals, who prized it above all others, embedded it into their peacock throne. Later, Persian ruler Nader Shah took the gem after sacking Delhi in 1739, reportedly giving it its current name. From Persia, it passed to Afghanistan, then to Punjab under the Sikh Empire. With every transfer, death followed. Leaders who possessed the Koh-i-Noor met violent ends, stabbed, poisoned, overthrown. Each regime that claimed it eventually crumbled. Was it merely coincidence? The normal tide of power and ambition? Or was there something darker at work? According to accounts from the 18th and early 19th centuries, the Koh-i-Noor was always accompanied by a warning, sometimes written, sometimes spoken aloud. A text, believed to be in Persian or Sanskrit, that cautioned against its use by male rulers. It was said that the stone would protect only those women who bore it, and bring misfortune to any man who dared. This curse, described by chroniclers and passed down in royal circles, was reportedly still known in the early 1800s, when the British East India Company annexed Punjab and claimed the diamond from the young Sikh ruler, Maharaja Duleep Singh. When the jewel was brought to England in 1850, there were rumors that the curse followed it. Queen Victoria, perhaps knowingly, never wore the stone herself as part of a crown. Her successors would also avoid donning it directly. Instead, it was placed in ceremonial regalia, worn only by royal women. But what happened to the curse itself? By the early 20th century, references to the original text began to disappear. No official record of the written curse exists in British archives. No copy in Persian, Urdu, or Sanskrit is preserved alongside the jewel in the tower. Some historians argue it was never written down, that the curse was oral tradition, more folklore than fact. But others point to 19th century journals and colonial dispatches that mention a parchment, a scroll, or an inscribed seal sent alongside the jewel from Lahore to Calcutta. One report even notes a British officer refusing to carry the warning, describing it as superstition of the most inconvenient sort. Could it have been deliberately destroyed, hidden, misplaced among the countless artifacts and documents absorbed by the East India Company? Or was it silenced to erase its power? There are those who believe the curse was suppressed by imperial hands eager to sanitize the story, to turn a symbol of conquest into one of continuity. A jewel can shine in a crown. A curse cannot. Others believe the British may have feared the text more than they let on, that destroying it was an act of control, not just over territory, but over meaning. More speculative theories push further still. Some writers suggest that the original curse may have contained references not only to death and destruction, but to time, a prophecy perhaps predicting the fall of future empires. One fringe historian claimed in a now-lost manuscript that the warning mentioned the stone outlasting the realm that held it. A poetic flourish? Or something deeper? There are even those who claim the curse is not lost at all, but held in secret, locked within the vaults of the British Museum or Royal Archives, accessible only to the highest levels of government. Could such a document, if it still exists, cast a shadow not just over history, but over the present? And what of Dalip Singh, the boy king who surrendered the diamond under duress and spent his life in lonely exile? In his final years, he tried to reclaim the stone, writing passionate letters to Queen Victoria. He never succeeded. His life, too, was marked by misfortune. Did the curse follow him? Did he perhaps understand its cost better than anyone? Today, the Koh-i-Noor remains one of the most contested diamonds in the world. India, Pakistan, Iran, and Afghanistan have all laid claim to it, yet none demand the return of the original curse, only the stone. But what if the text still exists, tucked inside a forgotten ledger, folded between fading maps, hidden in the archives of empire? What might it reveal after all this time? A warning to the future? Or a reminder of the past we choose not to read? As with so many mysteries of the British Empire, what has been lost may be just as telling as what remains. And somewhere, between the glitter of the diamond and the silence that surrounds it, the Koh-i-Noor's greatest secret still waits, unwritten. From the glittering silence of the Koh-i-Noor's missing curse, we now descend into a mystery not bound in gemstones or myth, but in paper, ink, ash. A mystery hidden not in what was preserved, but in what was deliberately destroyed. Picture a quiet British consulate in the waning days of empire. Tropical heat presses through shuttered windows. A diplomat, collar loosened, feeds bundle after bundle of documents into a furnace. Outside, the flag is about to be lowered for the last time. The colony, perhaps Kenya, Malaya, or Aden, will soon be independent, but inside, the past is being erased. This was Operation Legacy. Between the 1950s and early 1970s, as Britain prepared to dismantle the vast machinery of its empire, a highly secretive operation was set in motion. Its goal, to cleanse the historical record, to eliminate anything that could embarrass the crown, implicate British officials in wrongdoing, or expose the darker instruments of colonial control. The name was coldly poetic, Legacy. But whose legacy was being preserved, and at what cost? At its heart, Operation Legacy was a systematic program of concealment. Run by the Colonial Office and later absorbed into the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, it ordered officials in more than 30 colonies to identify and either repatriate or destroy documents deemed sensitive. These included files on mass detentions, torture, surveillance, racial policies, and covert operations. The instructions were meticulous. In Kenya, where Britain fought a brutal counterinsurgency against the Mau Mau Uprising, officials were told to incinerate reports of abuse in detention camps. In Malaya, intelligence files tracking communist sympathizers and civilian collaborators vanished into flames. In Zanzibar, Uganda, British Guyana, and elsewhere, entire categories of colonial intelligence, interrogation techniques, police operations, informant networks, were systematically eliminated. The orders were often delivered in code. Watch files, marked with a W, were to be examined for sensitivity. If a file was considered too damaging, it was to be disposed of by destruction, preferably by burning or dumping at sea. The cover story? That no records of significance had ever existed. For decades, this effort succeeded. Operation Legacy remained a phantom, unacknowledged even within official British histories of decolonization. It wasn't until 2011, during a lawsuit brought by Kenyan survivors of colonial-era torture, that fragments of the truth began to surface. And what they revealed was only a shadow of the original record. So what exactly was lost? We know from surviving memos that documents destroyed under Operation Legacy included accounts of forced labor, abuse of political prisoners, psychological warfare tactics, and blackmail strategies used to manipulate local leaders. They also included details of racial hierarchies entrenched by policy, and records of British knowledge, and, in some cases, orchestration of intercommunal violence. In some instances, specific names were listed for elimination, not of enemies, but of loyal collaborators, informants, or British officers whose actions might later be scrutinized. The destruction of these files was not merely administrative, it was political, legal, moral. But not all of it vanished. Some 8,800 files, known collectively as the Migrated Archives, were quietly shipped back to the UK and held at a secret facility in Hounslow Park, under the care of the Foreign Office. Their existence remained classified for decades. Only after mounting legal pressure were they slowly released to the National Archives. Yet this is where the mystery deepens. Historians studying the Migrated Archives noticed curious gaps. Files with consecutive serial numbers were missing. Indexes referenced documents that no longer exist. In some cases, descriptions of the contents, suggesting deeply compromising material, remain, but the documents themselves have disappeared. Were these simply destroyed late in the process, or hidden still? Could certain records have been transferred to intelligence agencies? Locked away indefinitely, classified not under the name of the Colonial Office, but under national security? If so, what secrets might they hold about operations, agreements, or atrocities never meant to be known? There are darker theories too. Some researchers believe Operation Legacy extended beyond the colonies and into Britain itself, cleansing files not just of local misconduct, but of systemic policies approved at the highest levels. Others have suggested that documents concerning the complicity of international allies or covert Cold War arrangements during decolonization may have been suppressed under parallel efforts, still undisclosed. And what about the offshore disposal? In a few cases, officials were instructed to dump sensitive records into deep-sea trenches, an act that raises difficult questions. What information was considered so explosive that it couldn't even risk destruction by fire? We may never know. One haunting example lies in the case of British Guyana. The colony, riven by Cold War politics and racial tensions, was a flashpoint of covert interference. Multiple files related to intelligence operations there are known to have existed, yet none have surfaced. Were they destroyed, or absorbed into darker bureaucratic shadows? Operation Legacy forces us to confront a troubling reality. It is not just that history is shaped by those who write it, it can also be erased by those who fear it. When we study empire, what are we really seeing? A curated version? A redacted page? Or a void where the truth once was? The question lingers. If these actions were merely unfortunate necessities of a messy transition, why were they buried so deeply, denied for so long? And what might still remain, tucked away in sealed archives, protected by official silence or disguised under false classifications? As with the missing curse of the Koh-i-Noor, it is not only what we possess that defines the legacy of empire, but what we have lost, or chosen to forget. Some fires leave behind ashes, others leave only questions. And in the quiet rooms of power, behind locked doors and dusty vaults, one can't help but wonder, what else was burned, and what still waits to be found? The ash of Operation Legacy has barely cooled, its embers revealing how empires do not always bury their secrets in fire, but sometimes in silence. Now we shift from hidden documents to buried gold, from vanished files to a tomb lost in time. This is not a mystery of the Imperial Archive, but of the earth itself. South India, the Deccan Plateau, a land of rolling hills and scorched red soil, where the monsoon rains drum on ancient stone. Among the ruins of once great forts, deep in the shadows of crumbling palaces and forgotten battlefields, lies a name that still echoes with resistance: Tipu Sultan, the Tiger of Mysore. To the British East India Company, he was a formidable enemy. To his people, he was a symbol of independence. But to historians and treasure hunters alike, Tipu Sultan remains something more. A man said to have guarded one of the greatest hidden hoards in colonial India, and possibly taken its secret to the grave. In 1799, at the height of the Fourth Anglo-Mysore War, British forces stormed the stronghold of Seringapatam. The siege was brutal. Cannons pounded the fortress walls. Soldiers waded across the River Cauvery under enemy fire. And when the British finally breached the city, they found Tipu Sultan's body lying among his fallen guards, still clutching his sword. His palace was looted, his wealth catalogued and taken. Jewels, ceremonial arms, gold ornaments, silver-inlaid weapons, and towering wardrobes of silk and ivory. These riches were sent to England, divided among officers, or absorbed into museums and private collections. But many believe this was only a fraction of what Tipu possessed. Contemporary accounts describe Tipu as a ruler of vast and carefully managed wealth. He was known to have stored treasure in secret vaults beneath his capital, and his correspondence with French and Ottoman allies hints at plans to hide assets from advancing British forces. Some reports speak of a hidden tomb, not for a body, but for a treasury, sealed beneath the city, possibly even beneath the river. A subterranean chamber carved into the bedrock, designed to remain undisturbed unless the Sultan himself gave the order. Yet, to this day, no such tomb has been found. Could it have been destroyed in the chaos of war? Or simply looted like the rest? Perhaps. But here the mystery deepens. In 1800, just 1 year after Tipu's death, several British officers reported finding walled-up chambers in the old city, some partially collapsed, others mysteriously empty. Maps drawn by military engineers showed inconsistencies in the layout beneath the palace grounds. One vault, noted in pencil, was marked "Unopened, Depth Unknown." That annotation was later removed. Decades later, in the late 19th century, a rumor spread among railway workers laying tracks through the region. They claimed to have unearthed a sealed stone passage beneath the old fortress foundations. The passage was filled in under orders from colonial authorities, who allegedly feared structural collapse, or something more. To this day, no formal excavation has been permitted beneath the original palace ruins. Historians remain divided. Many argue that the British took everything of value, and that the legend of a hidden tomb is just that, a legend. Others believe the treasure may have been dispersed before the fall, hidden in remote temples or entrusted to loyal retainers who took their secrets to the grave. One mainstream theory holds that Tipu used an ancient system of underground tunnels, some still visible today, to move assets away from Seringapatam as defeat loomed. In this scenario, the tomb may not lie beneath the city at all, but in one of several potential safe sites across the region, in the hills of Nandi, near the Shiva temples of Kolar, or buried within the layered courtyards of the Lalbagh Gardens in Bangalore, where Tipu's father once governed. And then, there are more speculative ideas. Some suggest the treasure was not just physical wealth, but also knowledge. Records of diplomatic ties, foreign technologies, or even sacred relics looted by earlier rulers and preserved under Tipu's protection. Could these have been hidden from the British not only to preserve India's material legacy, but to deny the empire its symbolic power? Other fringe theories point to the possibility of misdirection. That Tipu, ever the strategist, may have crafted the legend of the tomb deliberately, sending rumors swirling in every direction, while the real trove was smuggled out and lost in the confusion of war. One especially persistent story claims that Tipu's treasure included a golden tiger automaton, a mechanical sculpture capable of movement and sound, designed to mock a British soldier being mauled. The version now in the Victoria and Albert Museum is known and catalogued, but whispers suggest there was a second, larger, more elaborate, and never recovered. Was it mere myth? Or part of a greater cache, still hidden beneath centuries of soil and secrecy? In modern Srirangapatna, once Seringapatam, the past feels close. Tourists walk the fortress walls where cannons once fired. Local guides speak of spirits, of cursed chambers sealed with stone. Beneath the surface, perhaps, lie traces of a war that never truly ended. If the tomb of Tipu Sultan's treasure exists, what might it reveal? A secret vault untouched since 1799. The final defiance of a ruler determined to guard his kingdom, even in death? Or just another ghost story, crafted in the silence of defeat? There are no clear answers, no declarations. Only a question that lingers like incense in a temple courtyard. What still lies beneath the soil of Seringapatam, and will the tiger's secret ever be unearthed? As we continue through the lingering shadows of the British Empire, we find that some mysteries were not erased by fire, but hidden, perhaps forever, beneath stone. From the fading battlegrounds of Tipu Sultan's lost treasure, where secrets are thought to slumber beneath centuries of stone and soil, we journey now into quieter chambers, palaces not of war, but of words. Here, history is not buried, but rewritten. Not destroyed, but withheld. Windsor Castle. Rain presses softly against the windows. The marble corridors are silent, lined with portraits and the weight of imperial memory. In a quiet room overlooking the lawns, Queen Victoria once sat by candlelight, pen in hand, composing letters not to fellow monarchs or ministers of parliament, but to an Indian servant. A Muslim, a commoner, a man the British establishment would come to despise. His name was Abdul Karim, and the letters she wrote to him, now known only in fragments, have become the subject of intrigue, suppression, and speculation for more than a century. When Abdul Karim arrived in England in 1887, it was meant to be a gesture of token imperial celebration, a gift from India for the Queen's Golden Jubilee. 2 Indian attendants, brought from Agra to serve in her court. But within a year, Abdul Karim had risen far beyond his station. He became the Queen's confidant, her munshi, or teacher. He gave her Urdu lessons, brought her Indian food and books, and slowly opened her mind to a world her empire claimed to govern, yet rarely understood. Victoria, long known for her stoic exterior, wrote about him with startling affection. She called him her closest friend. He dined with her, traveled with her, and even had a cottage built for him at her Scottish estate. Royal courtiers watched with rising alarm as the Indian servant moved through palace halls with unusual freedom. And then came the letters. Dozens, perhaps hundreds of them. Personal correspondence from Victoria to Abdul Karim, handwritten in English and sometimes in Urdu. Letters that, by many accounts, spoke not only of daily affairs, but of India, of empire, and, most intriguingly, of her doubts. We know these letters existed. Some survive in British archives. Others were kept in Karim's family home in India for decades after his death, but many were destroyed. Upon Victoria's death in 1901, her son, now Edward VII, ordered an immediate purge. Abdul Karim was banished. His possessions were confiscated. His letters from the Queen were seized and burned. The royal household, it seems, was determined to erase any trace of their bond. But why? Was it simple racism? A discomfort with a queen showing deep trust in a colonial subject? Or was it something deeper? something the letters contained? Some scholars argue that Victoria's writings may have strayed into sensitive territory, that in moments of candor, she may have expressed sympathies toward Indian culture or concerns about British rule. Could the monarch who had accepted the title Empress of India have also privately questioned the cost of empire? We cannot know for certain. But what remains raises provocative questions. In one surviving letter, Victoria refers to the narrow minds of those around her who criticize Karim. In another, she praises Indian customs and dismisses what she calls the coldness of court. These are not the words of a distant ruler. They are deeply personal, reflective, and uncharacteristically open. There are claims, though unverified, that other letters touched upon British mismanagement during famines, the cruelty of certain administrators, and even expressed private outrage at the racism Karim endured. Were such words too dangerous for posterity? Did they challenge the carefully cultivated image of Victoria as a steadfast pillar of empire? Then there's the matter of what Karim may have written in return. Though less discussed, Karim's side of the correspondence is almost entirely missing. Only a few short notes remain. Where are the rest? Did he destroy them himself, fearing reprisal? Were they seized and hidden away, perhaps in royal archives never opened to public view? And what of the copies Victoria herself may have kept? Some theorize that select letters were stored at Balmoral, the Queen's retreat in Scotland, away from the prying eyes of London. Others wonder whether Karim smuggled certain papers back to India before his exile. In 2010, descendants of Abdul Karim revealed a small bundle of documents found in a family trunk: letters, photographs, and royal insignias. But still, the vast majority of their correspondence remains lost or hidden. Over the years, dramatized accounts of their relationship have reignited public interest, but often blur the lines between fact and romanticized fiction. What is certain is that Victoria's trust in Karim was genuine, and that those around her sought to dismantle that bond as swiftly and thoroughly as possible after her death. In doing so, they may have buried more than a relationship. They may have buried a rare and unfiltered window into the mind of a monarch shaped by empire, yet quietly, perhaps, questioning it. Could Queen Victoria, in her final years, have begun to see the empire not as glory, but as burden? Could the Indian letters contain reflections that history has chosen not to remember? Or is that merely projection, our need to find light in the shadows of conquest? The truth, like so many of the Queen's words, remains sealed. Some say permanently. The Royal Archives in Windsor still hold collections of Victoria's correspondence, but many are restricted, classified, or redacted. What lies behind those locked drawers and archivists' codes? Another letter? A confession? Or simply silence? As with the Koh-i-Noor's missing curse, or the documents destroyed in Operation Legacy, the mystery of Queen Victoria's Indian letters reminds us that not all imperial secrets were taken by sword or by flame. Some were written down, then taken away, and perhaps one day they will be read again. But until then, we are left to wonder, what did the Empress of India truly think of her empire, and what truths did she share, only with her Munshi? From the quiet intimacy of Queen Victoria's Indian letters, where friendship and empire quietly intertwined, we shift now to a moment of seismic consequence, an end that shook the foundation of British colonial history. But not simply because of who died, rather, because of what remains unspoken about the moments before. Birla House, New Delhi, January 30th, 1948. The late afternoon sun rests low in the sky, casting long shadows across the stone pathways and manicured gardens. The air is dry and still. Inside the stately white bungalow, the Mahatma is preparing for his daily prayer meeting, a quiet ritual in a turbulent time. He walks slowly toward the garden, leaning gently on 2 attendants. He is weak from fasting, yet composed. Clothed in simple homespun fabric, his bare feet pad lightly over the earth. A small crowd awaits him at the far end of the lawn. They rise as he approaches. Then, 3 shots. Mahatma Gandhi falls. His hands rise in an instinctive gesture of blessing or surrender. He utters the words, "Hey Ram," or perhaps nothing at all. The silence that follows is heavy, final, and somehow incomplete. The assassination of Gandhi is a moment etched into the consciousness of modern India and the fading shadow of the British Empire. The facts on the surface seem unambiguous. The assassin, Nathuram Godse, was apprehended at the scene. A trial followed. A confession was given. Justice, it seemed, was swift. But beneath the clarity of headlines and judicial process, strange inconsistencies remain. Details overlooked, testimonies silenced, and a timeline that still invites questions. Why was Gandhi left so vulnerable? Just months after one of the most violent partitions in world history? Why did multiple warnings of an assassination plot go unheeded? And perhaps most curiously, what exactly happened in the final hours before those fatal shots were fired? To begin with, security was unusually lax. Gandhi had survived previous attempts on his life. His own supporters, as well as police intelligence, had flagged credible threats. Just 10 days earlier, an unexploded bomb had been thrown near his prayer meeting, an ominous warning. And yet, on the day of his death, there were no armed guards, no thorough searches, no restrictions on those approaching him. Why? Some officials later claimed that Gandhi himself refused protection. Others pointed to bureaucratic confusion, or even the inexperience of India's newly independent government. But internal memos, some declassified only decades later, suggest that British intelligence, which remained closely involved in the region's transition, had also received indications of the plot. Did they pass on the warnings? Were they ignored? Or was there a conscious decision to step back? This is where the record begins to fragment. Then there is the question of the assassin's access. Godse approached Gandhi in plain sight, his pistol hidden beneath a shawl. He had mingled with the crowd with ease. Some witnesses claimed he had been present at previous gatherings, unchallenged. But what many forget is that Godse was not acting alone. He belonged to a wider conspiracy, one involving other right-wing nationalists, several of whom had known links to underground organizations and who had been under surveillance. One of those men, Madan Lal Pahwa, had been arrested for the earlier bombing attempt and spoke freely of his plans during interrogation. Yet little action followed. Some arrests were made. Others slipped through the net, and Godse, despite being on record as a radical agitator, remained free. Did the authorities underestimate the threat, or was something more deliberate at work? There are stranger elements still. Gandhi's final conversations, particularly those held in private, remain partly undocumented. His last written notes are vague, referencing meetings and messages now lost. Some reports claim he received a visitor that morning whose identity was never publicly disclosed. Another points to an intercepted letter warning of violence, but the letter itself has disappeared. Even Gandhi's final utterance has been debated for decades. Did he truly say, "Hey Ram," invoking the name of God with his dying breath? Or was this a poetic addition, added by followers to elevate the moment into symbolism? One eyewitness claimed he heard no words at all. Another said Gandhi tried to speak, but only blood came. These contradictions may seem small, but in the context of such a monumental death, they leave a lingering sense of the unresolved. More speculative theories have emerged in the decades since. Some suggest that elements within India's new political leadership viewed Gandhi as an obstacle to a modern centralized state. his emphasis on non-violence, rural self-rule, and unity with Muslims increasingly out of step with a nation scarred by partition. Others have looked outward. Could British intelligence have been more entangled in post-independence unrest than was admitted? If Gandhi's continued moral authority threatened strategic interests, economic, military, or political, might there have been reason to step aside? Or worse, to allow certain forces to act unimpeded? There is no concrete evidence of official complicity, but the silences, the misplaced documents, the ignored warnings, the lack of clear accountability have only deepened the mystery. Today, Birla House is a museum. The spot where Gandhi fell is marked by a simple stone and garlanded daily by visitors. His legacy, vast and complex, is preserved in speeches, writings, and memory. But his final hours remain partially veiled. What was said? What was planned? What warnings were ignored or perhaps buried? As with so many mysteries tied to the fall of empire, the truth may not lie in a single conspiracy or smoking gun, but in a network of subtle absences. A slow retreat from clarity, a moment too important, too painful, or too disruptive to confront in full. And so we are left with a question, still echoing in the garden's hush. What truly happened before the Mahatma fell? And why, after all these years, does so much still remain unspoken? From the hushed shadows of Gandhi's final hours, where absence speaks louder than confession, we now turn to a mystery set among mountains older than empires, and silence heavier than gunfire. Welcome to Afghanistan. Not the Afghanistan of today's headlines, but of 1878, when the British Empire, obsessed with protecting its northwestern frontier from Russian influence, launched one of its most ill-fated campaigns, the Second Anglo-Afghan War. The conflict would end in uneasy diplomacy and brutal loss. But nearly 150 years later, it's not just the battles or the policy missteps that leave historians puzzled. It's the missing files. Official British records of the war, whole segments of correspondence, campaign reports, intelligence briefings, and diplomatic communiques have vanished from the archives. Some are redacted, others never arrived. Many more are simply unaccounted for. How do you lose a war's worth of paperwork? And more importantly, why? The Second Anglo-Afghan War was launched under the premise of preempting Russian influence in Kabul. In 1878, a Russian envoy arrived uninvited at the Afghan court, triggering British fears of strategic encirclement. When the Afghans refused a British mission in return, war was declared. British and Indian troops crossed into Afghanistan in late 1878. The fighting was swift and brutal. Cities like Ali Masjid, Kandahar, and Kabul became theaters of colonial siege warfare. A puppet emir was installed. Treaties were signed under duress. By 1880, Britain declared victory and withdrew. On paper, it was a success, but the reality was murkier. Casualty rates were high. Local resistance never fully collapsed. The campaign's costs, in gold and blood, were considerable. But the most troubling legacies of the war may lie not in what was recorded, but in what was quietly removed from view. At the heart of the mystery are the official war archives housed at the India Office Records and various British regimental repositories. While thousands of pages remain intact, logistics, troop movements, public dispatches, researchers have long noted troubling gaps in the record. Entire months of field reports are missing. Ciphered telegrams referenced in cabinet minutes have no surviving original. High-level political communications between the Governor-General and London, especially those involving covert dealings with tribal leaders, appear to have been edited or entirely expunged. More puzzling still, multiple references exist to documents that cannot be found. Letters that refer to earlier memos no longer traceable. Orders issued by generals whose paper trail abruptly ends mid-campaign. Anomalies not of destruction by time, but of erasure by design. Was it simply wartime chaos, archival mismanagement, or something more deliberate? Some historians argue the missing files were casualties of bureaucratic overload, a colonial administration overwhelmed by logistical strain and field conditions. The war was fought across rugged terrain, with documents transported by mule, telegraph, or by hand. Loss was inevitable, but others are not convinced. One theory holds that documents were intentionally withheld or destroyed after the war, part of a quiet effort to obscure political misjudgments and intelligence failures. There were known disputes within the British command, conflicting strategies, unauthorized maneuvers, and internal disagreements between civil administrators and military officers. Could missing records reflect decisions the empire did not want scrutinized? And then there is the matter of the political assassinations. During the war, key figures in the Afghan hierarchy were killed, some under suspicious circumstances. British involvement was always denied, yet certain files concerning these episodes are either heavily redacted or entirely missing. Were there secret agreements? Promises made and broken? Names recorded, then deleted? The most persistent theory involves covert British-Russian diplomacy, what came to be known as the Great Game. Some researchers suggest that sensitive files from the Second Afghan War may have included secret arrangements with Russian intermediaries or intelligence reports that contradicted the official justification for invasion. If Britain invaded to check Russian power, why then do surviving telegrams hint at prior contact with Russian agents in Kabul, suggesting that back-channel communication may have occurred even before the war began? Could it be that the war was not merely a reaction to Russian encroachment, but a calculated move tied to broader imperial maneuvering? If so, revealing such motives might have exposed London to international embarrassment. And what of the native informants, the Afghan guides, interpreters, and tribal leaders who aided British forces? Were they promised protection, land, titles? Many were later imprisoned, exiled, or assassinated. Yet no formal records explain why. One former colonial officer, writing anonymously in the 1920s, described the war's end as a curtain drawn swiftly over a room still filled with smoke. More speculative voices claim that some missing files may have contained early mentions of mineral or archaeological interests in the Afghan highlands, long before such concerns became mainstream in the 20th century. Could military scouts have stumbled upon something unusual? Ancient ruins? Lost trade routes? Geopolitical knowledge too valuable or too volatile to be shared? It's impossible to say, but what we do know is that a surprisingly large number of files were reviewed by the Foreign Office again during the late 1940s, over half a century after the war ended. Why? And why did some of those files go missing during the process of decolonization? Some now suspect that Operation Legacy, the secret program to cleanse Britain's colonial record, as we explored earlier, may have swept through older wars as well, not just recent ones. If true, it raises a deeper question. What history of empire have we already lost? Today, the British archives still hold the shadows of the Second Afghan War. But for every preserved dispatch or general's diary, there is a corresponding blank page, a reference without a document, a question without an answer. In Kabul and Kandahar, locals still speak of British incursions with bitter memory. In London, few remember the war at all. But between these two poles, across time, distance, and intent, lies a void. What was written that we were not meant to read? And what truths vanished with the paper, the ink, the silence? As with so many imperial mysteries, the story of the Second Afghan War is not just about what happened, but about what was removed from the record. And in that quiet space, the question lingers still. What secrets lie inside a file that no longer exists? From the missing files of Afghanistan, lost in shadow and silence, we now follow the imperial thread further south, to the highlands of East Africa, to a land where myth and monarchy are interwoven, and where one of the most sacred relics of biblical history is said to lie hidden behind ancient stone walls. Ethiopia, a country never colonized, but forever entangled in imperial designs, a land of jagged escarpments, sun-bleached plains, and deep historical memory. At the heart of that memory stands a mystery that spans millennia, the fate of the Ark of the Covenant, and, more specifically, what role the British may have played in its story. The town of Axum lies in the north, surrounded by hills that glow gold at dusk. Its air is dry, and its stone obelisks cast long shadows across grassy fields. But behind a modest, guarded chapel, barely larger than a village church, rests a claim more ancient than empire. This, according to the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, is the resting place of the Ark of the Covenant, the sacred chest said to have been built by Moses under divine instruction, the object that once held the tablets of the Ten Commandments, a relic of immense spiritual power, lost to history since the fall of the First Temple in Jerusalem. For centuries, Ethiopian clergy have maintained that the Ark was brought here by Menelik I, the son of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, around the 10th century BC. Since then, it is said to have been protected in secret, unseen by any except a single guardian monk, appointed for life, and never replaced until death. No outsider has ever verified its presence. But in 1868, the British came closer than anyone else. The journey began with war. Emperor Tewodros II of Ethiopia, once an ally of Britain, had grown frustrated with perceived diplomatic insults and delays. In 1864, he imprisoned several British officials and missionaries in the fortress of Magdala. A response was demanded. The British, under General Robert Napier, assembled a massive expeditionary force, complete with elephants, engineers, and artillery, and launched one of the most logistically complex military campaigns of the Victorian era. They fought their way into the heart of the Ethiopian highlands, defeated Tewodros's forces, and recovered the captives. The emperor took his own life as the British breached the gates of Magdala. But what followed the victory would echo far longer. Napier's troops looted the imperial treasury. Manuscripts, crowns, crosses, jewelry, and religious artifacts were taken, some now held in British museums, others lost to time. Among the objects recorded were relics associated with Ethiopian kingship, some believed by locals to have links to the Ark itself. One British officer, Lieutenant Henry Blenkinsop, described seeing an ornate chest carried by priests before the looting began. He made no claim that it was the Ark, but referred to it as an object of fearful reverence among the Ethiopians. What was it, and where did it go? Mainstream historians tend to downplay any direct connection between the British and the Ark itself. Most suggest that the sacred object, if it exists, was never kept at Magdala, but remained in Axum, untouched. Yet troubling questions remain. Why were specific clerical items removed by the British but never officially catalogued? Why were several crates of manuscripts and ecclesiastical artifacts shipped back to England, only to vanish from public record? And what of the reports from Napier's engineers, documents that reference sealed vaults beneath the church compound that were never properly explored? Could the British have seen something they didn't understand or chose not to mention? There is also the matter of the monk. According to Ethiopian tradition, the guardian of the Ark lives in complete isolation, tending to the sacred relic without interruption. but during the British approach to Magdala, there were reports of monks fleeing with objects wrapped in cloth, carried under armed escort into the mountains. Was the Ark moved for safety, or was it never there to begin with? In the 20th century, journalists and explorers from Britain and elsewhere attempted to gain access to the chapel at Axum. All were denied. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church remains firm. The Ark is real, and it will never be shown. In 1989, British writer Graham Hancock stirred controversy by suggesting that the Ark had been smuggled out of Jerusalem, kept for centuries in Egypt, and ultimately brought to Ethiopia, where it may have survived longer than any imperial record can verify. Critics labeled it speculative, but Hancock's research did highlight one unsettling pattern: repeated British and later European interest in Axum during key political transitions. Could it be that Britain's involvement in Ethiopia was not purely diplomatic or military? That there were rumors, even in the 19th century, of a biblical treasure in these highlands? And if so, did those rumors inform certain actions not recorded in official reports? Today, the supposed resting place of the Ark, St. Mary of Zion Chapel, is guarded by a lone monk, as tradition dictates. No photos, no visitors, no verification. The British Museum still holds looted objects from Magdala. Some are on display, others remain in storage. Calls for repatriation continue. Among the disputed artifacts are religious items described in old lists as sacred tabots, replicas of the Ark used in Ethiopian ceremony. But what of the original? Is it still in Axum, guarded in silence? Or was it taken, intentionally or unknowingly, during the colonial upheaval? The British Empire was no stranger to collecting sacred objects. From Egyptian mummies to Indian relics, its agents often dismissed local belief while seizing items of immense cultural value. Might the Ark, if it existed, have slipped into that same imperial pattern? As with so many mysteries left in the empire's wake, the truth is obscured not by myth but by missing context, by gaps in record, by secrecy, by reverence. If the Ark of the Covenant does rest in Ethiopia, it remains the only biblical relic never subjected to modern scrutiny. If it doesn't, then something equally powerful still lingers in its place. The idea that sacred truth can survive invasion, denial, and even empire. So we are left to ask, did the British come closer to the Ark than history admits? And if they did, was it left behind or taken home in silence? From the veiled sanctum of Axum to the echoing silence of British museums, we move now to another enigma, a collection of artwork so masterfully wrought, so impossibly advanced for its time and place, that even its discovery stunned the very empire that looted it. The Benin bronzes. Not a single object, but hundreds, possibly thousands, of plaques, heads, altarpieces, and ceremonial figures cast in intricate metalwork. Many now lie in the British Museum's shadowed halls, glinting beneath controlled light. But they were not born in Britain. They emerged from the heart of the Kingdom of Benin, modern-day southern Nigeria, a civilization as complex as it was misunderstood. And today, despite decades of scholarship, one fundamental question remains unanswered. How did they come to be? The setting is the royal palace of Benin, sometime in the 16th century. High red earth walls encircle the complex, bustling with courtiers, priests, warriors, and artists. Inside, an Oba, king, sits upon a throne surrounded by ancestral shrines and bronze memorial heads. In a chamber lit by palm oil lamps, artisans of the Igun Iranwan Guild melt metal in crucibles, shaping molten brass into scenes of royalty, ritual, and conquest. The works they produce are unlike anything else in West Africa, stylized yet naturalistic, symmetrical yet fluid. Their technique, lost wax casting, a process used in antiquity, but here elevated to an almost transcendent perfection. By the time Europeans arrived on West Africa's coast, The art was already ancient. But it wasn't until 1897, during the British punitive expedition, that the West came face to face with the full scale of Benin's artistic legacy. After a British diplomatic mission was ambushed en route to Benin City, a retaliatory force, armed with Maxim guns and Imperial vengeance, invaded. The city was sacked, palaces burned, cultural treasures seized. From the ruins, crates of bronzes were shipped back to London. They were auctioned, catalogued, and dispersed across Europe and the United States. But what British soldiers had assumed would be simple tribal relics turned out to be something else entirely. The bronzes revealed an advanced artistic tradition dating back centuries. Their detail rivaled, some said exceeded, contemporary European work. Naturalistic depictions of court life, warriors, Portuguese traders, and mythological beings spoke of a complex, literate, highly organized society. Where had this come from? Initial European reactions were steeped in disbelief. Many Victorian scholars simply refused to believe the bronzes were African. The techniques, they claimed, must have been imported from Portuguese traders or Arab artisans or some long-lost Mediterranean influence. Some even suggested that the bronzes were too sophisticated to have come from the African mind. But this was projection, not proof. Over time, scholars confirmed that the casting methods were indigenous. The tools, the molds, the iconography, all reflected local culture and spiritual tradition. Oral histories traced the Igun Guild's lineage back to Oba Ogwola in the 13th century. And yet, the mystery deepened. Because while we can trace the artistic lineage, the origin of the technology remains blurred. Where did the Benin craftsmen first learn the lost wax method? Who taught the first generation of royal casters? And how, in the heart of the rainforest, did they access the metallurgical knowledge required to smelt brass and bronze with such precision? The region lacked native sources of copper and zinc, key ingredients in bronze. These metals had to be imported, likely through complex trade networks stretching into North Africa and beyond. So, who were the intermediaries? Some theories suggest that the knowledge arrived via trans-Saharan trade routes, carried by merchants from Mali or Songhai, whose own cultures were shaped by centuries of contact with North Africa and the Islamic world. Others posit even older roots, perhaps connections to the ancient Nok civilization, whose terracotta figures date back to 1000 BC and who may have laid the artistic groundwork for later bronze traditions. A few fringe theories go further. They point to similarities between Benin's art and that of ancient Egypt or even Mesopotamia. They argue that symbolic elements, stylized eyes, rigid postures, hieratic scale, could suggest long-forgotten cultural diffusion. But evidence is thin, and academic consensus remains cautious. Still, the question endures. How did a supposedly isolated kingdom develop techniques that mirrored, and in some cases outpaced, the achievements of the Renaissance? Another unexplained element lies in the sheer scale of the output. Hundreds of large bronze plaques, ceremonial heads, and statues were housed in the royal compound, each requiring vast amounts of metal, labor, and technical skill. How did Benin sustain such a large-scale artistic economy? Were there outside sponsors, foreign commissions, or was the bronze work supported entirely by royal patronage? Some historians speculate that Benin's diplomatic and trade relationships, particularly with Portugal from the late 15th century onward, may have allowed for an influx of raw materials and artistic exchange. Yet this doesn't explain the existence of older bronzes, made before contact with Europe. Could it be that what we call the Benin bronzes are the visible remains of an even older tradition, one now lost to fire, conquest, and time? Today, the bronzes are at the center of heated debates over repatriation and restitution. Museums across Europe hold pieces that were taken by force. Nigeria has begun building a new museum in Benin City to house the artifacts that are slowly being returned. But beneath the legal and ethical battles lies a deeper, unresolved puzzle. Not just who owns the bronzes, but where they truly came from. What traditions informed their symbolism? What unknown teachers passed down the method? What cultural memory lies encoded in metal that refuses to decay? The British Empire did not just loot objects. It disrupted narratives, severed knowledge from context. And in that rupture, the mystery of the bronze's origin lingers. Are they the pinnacle of a known tradition, or echoes of a forgotten one? What knowledge was lost when Benin burned? And what stories might the bronzes still carry, if only we knew how to read them? From the looted bronzes of Benin, artifacts pried from palaces and shrouded in silence, we now drift eastward across the Indian Ocean, through humid ports and railway lines that once pulsed with colonial ambition, into the dust and shadow of the subcontinent, where another mystery lies buried, not in sculpture or script, but in something heavier, more elusive, more volatile: gold. Not the ornamental gold of royal necklaces or gilded weaponry, but bullion, tonnage, shipments, vaults, accounts that do not balance, ledgers that whisper instead of explain. This is the story of the phantom gold of the British Raj, a riddle that spans empires and eras, a fortune perhaps too vast to be seen in full, and whose traces vanish just when they seem closest to the light. Begin in Calcutta, 1858. The air hangs thick with monsoon heat and gunpowder residue. The Indian Rebellion, what the British called the Mutiny, has been violently suppressed. The East India Company, once a commercial titan, is dissolved. Governance of India shifts directly to the crown. With this transition comes not just power, but the machinery of empire, taxation, banking, and the steady movement of wealth. British officials begin to centralize India's vast economic resources: agricultural rents, land taxes, war indemnities, under a single colonial treasury. Gold, silver, and specie flow through fortified counting houses, through steamers and trains, through corridors of power invisible to the public eye. According to official records, this gold paid for infrastructure, military campaigns, and administrative reforms. But unofficially, the math doesn't add up. Some say vast sums disappeared, quietly, consistently, over decades. Vanished not in a single theft or embezzlement, but through a pattern more systematic, more engineered. Where did it go? In the 1920s, amid rising Indian nationalist sentiment, a curious rumor began to circulate among independence activists and journalists. It alleged that during the early years of Crown rule, between 1860 and 1900, large shipments of gold bullion had been removed from India under conditions of secrecy. Not coin, not jewelry, but raw bars of gold, some allegedly sent to London, others to outposts in Africa. A few more mysteriously disappeared en route, supposedly lost at sea or misreported entirely. The files are vague. Shipping manifests contain gaps. Bank of England records reference private consignments, unlinked to corporate or public accounts. British officials, when questioned, offered no explanation beyond routine treasury movements. But routine doesn't quite fit. What makes the gold phantom-like is not its lack of documentation, but the peculiar selectivity of that documentation. A 1901 memorandum from the India Office speaks of a reserve transfer to His Majesty's government in support of Imperial stabilization. No weight is given, no vault location cited. Another internal letter from the late 1880s mentions an extraction from Bombay holdings of unusual magnitude, but omits any mention of its purpose or destination. Years later, during World War I, India's contribution to Britain's war effort was immense, not only in men, but in money. According to estimates, over 100 million, equivalent to billions today, in gold and specie was exported from Indian treasuries to Britain. Yet a portion of this gold was never reconciled in post-war economic audits. Why not? And what happened to the lost wartime gold shipments, one of which, recorded as traveling aboard a steamer in 1916, was reportedly torpedoed and sunk off the coast of Aden, but no wreck was ever conclusively identified? Speculative theories begin here. Some believe that this phantom gold helped fund clandestine imperial projects, secret campaigns, diplomatic bribes, or covert intelligence operations far from Indian soil. There are references in MI5's early archives to irregularly financed engagements during colonial unrest in Sudan and Persia. Could Indian gold have backed such ventures? Others suspect a financial motive, that gold was used to prop up the British pound or the gold standard during times of economic volatility. Quiet injections of bullion into the Bank of England's reserves, unattributed but critical. If so, it would mark India not just as a colony of soldiers and subjects, but as a hidden economic lifeline. And then there are whispers, fringe but persistent, of a buried reserve. A secret cache of gold siphoned during the height of Raj administration and hidden before decolonization. Some place it in the Himalayan foothills. Others say it was transferred to private British vaults in Kenya or even Australia. There is no definitive proof, but the documents that do exist suggest a pattern of concealment, not mere oversight. Indian leaders of the independence movement, including Jawaharlal Nehru and Sardar Patel, raised concerns about the lack of economic transparency during the final years of British rule. In particular, they questioned the hard currency reserves transferred out of India between 1945 and 1947. An internal communication dated May 1947, just months before independence, refers obliquely to materials and capital repatriated from Indian Dominion holdings. What materials? And why the sudden urgency? When India gained independence, it did so without access to full records of its colonial treasury. London held the keys. To this day, multiple files relating to India's economic contribution to the empire remain classified or redacted under official secrecy acts. So where does that leave the mystery? Perhaps the gold was used. Perhaps it was lost. Perhaps there never was a secret cache. Only sloppy accounting and the chaos of wartime logistics. Or perhaps, just perhaps, a portion of India's immense wealth was absorbed into the shadow infrastructure of empire, removed not just from vaults, but from memory. No plaque, no monument, no record, only a faint glimmer, like a sunlit coin at the bottom of a dark river. Today, efforts to trace the phantom gold of the British Raj continue by historians, economists, and journalists, but the paper trail grows fainter with each passing decade, and so we are left to ask, how much gold moved through the British Empire unseen? And how much of India's lost wealth lies not in legend, but in ledgers that will never again be opened? From the whispered ledger entries of phantom gold in India, we journey now to a far more literal disappearance, one that unfolded beneath the sun-bleached skies of Central Africa. Here, among the red soil trails, scattered baobabs, and ancient tribal lands, the British Empire once sent its cartographers and scholars to map the unknown. But not every map was completed. Not every line was drawn. And not every explorer came back. This is the story of a man officially remembered only by profession and rank. an Imperial geographer sent deep into Africa's interior in the final decade of the 19th century, and never seen again. The last known report placed him in what was then called the Lotto Enclave, an obscure wedge of contested territory in present-day South Sudan, near the borders of the Belgian Congo and British Uganda. The year was 1898. The region was wild and unmapped, a mosaic of jungle, marsh, and high plateau. At the time, European powers were engaged in a frenzied, often chaotic division of the African continent, a geopolitical scrabble known as the Scramble for Africa. Boundaries were drawn and redrawn with little regard for existing cultures, landscapes, or realities. Into this uncertainty stepped the geographer, a man trained in land survey, topography, and colonial policy. He had worked previously in India and the Sudan. His name appears only briefly in surviving correspondence: R.D. Martin, Imperial Office for African Survey. And even that spelling varies. He was tasked with mapping a corridor of land for a proposed railway route meant to connect the Upper Nile to British holdings further south, a line of transport and empire. But what he found, or what found him, remains unknown. Martin departed from Khartoum in the summer of 1898, accompanied by a small retinue of porters, 2 local guides, and a translator reportedly familiar with several Nilotic dialects. By all accounts, the journey began without incident. Several letters from Martin, sent via dispatch runners, describe the terrain as challenging but navigable, the local populations as cautiously observant. Then, silence. By early November, the Royal Geographical Society in London noted his failure to report. A relief party was organized, delayed by bureaucracy and the growing instability of the modest conflict. When British officers finally reached the general area of his last known location in early 1899, there was no trace. No camp, no bodies, no journals, nothing. Only a discarded sextant, of a type issued by the Imperial Survey Corps, was found near a dry riverbed. It was half buried in soil, corroded by months of exposure. And that was it. The official report filed to the India office dismissed the case as a regrettable incident likely caused by disease, local hostility, or misnavigation. It concluded the region too dangerous for continued search and recommended the assignment be considered closed. But unofficial whispers told a stranger tale. A Belgian missionary, stationed at a remote post in the Congo Free State, claimed in a private letter that native hunters had described a white man with iron instruments who entered the forest and walked into the ground. Another report, dismissed as hearsay, involved sightings of a man who spoke no local tongue but carried a British satchel, living alone among riverine reeds, his eyes always measuring. These were, of course, unverified. And yet they were not the only anomalies. In the years that followed, maps produced from that region included odd inconsistencies. Elevation markers that led to nowhere, river paths that abruptly vanished, geographic features, hills, valleys, plateaus, listed by Martin's name in early sketches, but never again recorded in subsequent surveys. Where did those features go? Did he discover something? An error, a secret, a place, meant to remain untouched? Some suggest Martin may have uncovered mineral deposits, perhaps gold, perhaps uranium, too valuable to document publicly, triggering a quiet cover-up by competing colonial interests. Others believe he strayed into sacred or taboo territory, where the consequences of trespass were irreversible. But the most enduring theory is simpler and stranger, that Martin vanished by design. According to notes found decades later in the Royal Geographical Society's restricted archives, Martin had expressed disillusionment with the role of imperial cartographers. In one letter, written but apparently never sent, he wrote, "The more I map, the more I am unmaking. We impose false lines on a land that never asked for them. I begin to wonder if the land itself resists us." What did he mean? Could he have staged his own disappearance, slipping away into the vastness of a land he no longer wished to help colonize? Did he abandon his task not through accident, but by choice? Or was the letter merely a reflection of fatigue, the ramblings of a man too long alone in foreign terrain? Martin's family, what little remains of the record, made no public complaint. No obituary appeared in the Times, only a brief notice in a colonial gazette. Surveyor missing, presumed lost. The land where he vanished remains remote, undersurveyed, and geopolitically complex. Modern researchers attempting to revisit the route have found the terrain uncooperative, dotted with inaccessible wetlands, flash floods, and the slow reclamation of jungle over path. There is no known grave, no preserved journal, only a name fading at the edge of old maps. So what became of R.D. Martin, the Imperial Geographer? Did he perish in the wilderness? Was he taken by local forces, disease, or wildlife? Or did he find a silence so complete, a land so untouched, that he chose to remain within it? Even now, the mystery clings to the margins of empire's memory. Not bold enough for legend, not clear enough for history, just a blank space in a place meant to be measured. And so we ask, can a man map the unknown only to be claimed by it? And when an empire loses its cartographer, what else might it lose along with him? From the lost geographer in Africa, whose footsteps faded into the unmapped wilderness, we now turn to another kind of disappearance. Not of one man, but of many. Not in the deserts or highlands of East Africa, but in the dense, humid canopy of northern South America. This is the mystery of the vanished British colony in Guyana, an eerie echo of Roanoke, a settlement that once appeared in records, only to vanish without trace, leaving behind a single name and endless questions. Along the coast of present-day Guyana, the jungle doesn't end at the tree line. It begins in the air. The heat wraps around you like wet fabric. The trees stretch skyward in thick, interlocking canopies. Below, rivers coil through the underbrush like muscular, living things. This is a place where nature reclaims everything. It is here, somewhere between the mouths of the Demerara and Essequibo rivers, that British officials once hoped to establish a model colonial community. Sometime in the early 1800s, records conflict, a small group of settlers, including civil engineers, tradesmen, and soldiers, was dispatched inland from the coastal town of Bartica. Their mission: to establish a fortified outpost that would serve both as a trading hub and as a base of exploration deeper into the interior. They were well supplied, armed, and they were never heard from again. At the time, British Guyana was a contested landscape, wedged between Dutch interests and Portuguese Brazil. Its interior was largely unknown to Europeans, inhabited by indigenous nations who had long resisted outside intrusion. British colonial planners, driven by a mixture of economic ambition and imperial pride, saw potential in the land's natural resources: timber, rubber, gold, and hoped to tame what they called the wild frontier. This particular expedition, never officially named, was reportedly part of a confidential directive issued by the Colonial Office in London. Correspondence stored at the British Library speaks cryptically of a Group L-42 dispatched for long-range settlement assessment. No published map ever bore the colony's name. No journal has been found detailing its progress. What we know comes from fragments. A logbook noting a departure date in 1809. A supply invoice for tools, weapons, and seed. And a final letter from a senior officer, Lieutenant Harcourt, describing promising elevation above the floodplain and unusual stillness in the forest. After that, nothing. By 1812, when a relief group was sent to check on the colony's progress, there was no sign of it. No cleared land, no ruined cabins, no graves, not even remnants of tools or iron spikes. The jungle was intact, as if nothing had disturbed it. The search party returned in silence, their official report noting only that no evidence of habitation could be confirmed. The British administration, distracted by the Napoleonic Wars and growing unrest in other colonies, quietly shelved the matter. Over time, the incident was forgotten, except by a few. Local Amerindian oral traditions tell of pale-skinned men arriving during the rainy season, settling briefly along a river bend, and then vanishing. In one version of the tale, the settlers angered forest spirits by cutting sacred trees. In another, they attempted to mine a forbidden hill and were taken by the ground. These stories are rich in metaphor, but they raise a curious point. How could an entire group of armed, trained men, equipped with tools, firearms, and animals, disappear without trace? Could disease have struck? Yellow fever, malaria, or some unknown pathogen? Some historians suggest the settlers may have perished and been consumed by the jungle, their wooden structures rotted by humidity, their remains scattered by animals. In a land where the forest can swallow a house within weeks, such erasure is possible. But others argue that something doesn't add up. If it were disease, where were the bones? The abandoned equipment? The graves? And if there was conflict, either with local populations or within the group itself, why no evidence of struggle? In the 1930s, a British anthropologist named Reginald Hartley claimed to have found what he believed were colonial-era bricks and charred timber fragments deep in the interior, near the Pataro River. His notes describe a low rise that may have once held structures, partially buried under sediment and roots, but Hartley died before he could return for excavation. His samples have since been lost. Later expeditions in the 1970s and early 2000s found nothing at the site he marked. Was Hartley mistaken? Or did he get too close to a story someone preferred to remain buried? Fringe theories have flourished. Some posit that the colony was part of an early covert mining operation, seeking not just gold but rare earth minerals. Others suggest that it may have uncovered something, perhaps archaeological, perhaps spiritual, that local forces chose to protect. And then there's the suggestion, unsubstantiated but persistent, that the British themselves erased the colony from record. That something went wrong, terribly wrong, and that the absence of evidence is not an accident, but policy. Could this have been an experiment in settler resettlement that failed catastrophically? Was there internal dissent, even mutiny? Or did something happen in that jungle? Something that could not be explained, leading authorities to bury not just the colony, but the truth. Even today, local legends persist. Hunters occasionally report strange stone alignments or unnatural clearings in places with no nearby villages. There are claims, always second-hand, of old musket balls found deep in riverbeds, or of moss-covered timbers arranged in unnatural patterns. No formal excavation has ever been mounted. No name was ever officially attached to the lost colony. In archival references, it is known only by its last recorded designation, Site 42. Its people, its plans, its fate vanished. So what happened to the Roanoke-like colony in Guyana? Did the forest take them? Did they fall victim to nature, or to history, or to something older and less known? Was it a simple failure, lost to time? Or was it an episode in imperial history deliberately erased? And perhaps most unsettling of all, could the jungle still be holding the answer, waiting for someone brave or foolish enough to ask the right question in the wrong place? From the vanishing settlement in Guyana, swallowed by forest, forgotten by empire, we shift now to another place where the British left behind both tracks and silence. In the dense jungles and mist-draped highlands of Burma, modern-day Myanmar, lie remnants of a colonial ambition born of steel, sweat, and war. Rusted rails wind through overgrown valleys, and tunnels carved through ancient hills breathe cold air into the jungle heat. Some are still used, others have collapsed, but a few remain eerily intact, sealed off, unmarked, and avoided by locals who speak of whispers in the dark, lights where no man walks, and trains that never reach their destination. These are the haunted railway tunnels of Burma. And what haunts them is not always seen. To understand their story, one must return to the early 20th century, when the British Empire, tightening its grip on Southeast Asia, sought to link India to Burma by rail. The plan was bold: a strategic railway line that would run from British-controlled Assam through the dense, mountainous jungles of northern Burma, eventually connecting to Rangoon, now Yangon. Officially, it was an infrastructure project to promote trade. Unofficially, it was a military artery, a means to move troops and supplies swiftly across Britain's eastern frontier. Construction began in fits and starts. Rainy seasons turned roads into rivers. Insects and disease decimated labor crews. The terrain was merciless, the jungles filled with venomous snakes and ancient shifting landslides. But the British persisted. Tunnels were blasted through hillsides using black powder and dynamite. Stone was cut by hand. Prisoners, indentured workers, and conscripted locals formed the backbone of the labor force. And then came the war. In the early 1940s, with the rise of Imperial Japan and the outbreak of World War II in the East, the railway gained new urgency. The Japanese invasion of Burma forced Allied forces to retreat toward India. In desperation, the British began expanding older tunnel systems, some of which had never been completed in the first place, and initiated a series of emergency railway operations, some so secretive they were not officially recorded. Among these was a tunnel complex near the town of Shipaw, high in the Shan Hills. Known to locals as the Tunnel of Eight Echoes, it was said to be nearly a kilometer long, built hastily with the help of thousands of forced laborers, many of whom would never emerge alive. British soldiers stationed nearby referred to it ominously in letters as the place where sound dies. No official map marks its exact location. After the war, the tunnel, like many others in the region, was sealed. Some say it collapsed, others say it was closed deliberately, too unstable to maintain. But the stories did not stop. Local villagers speak of cries in the night near the overgrown entrance, sounds of stone grinding, picks striking rock, and muffled shouts in languages long since vanished. In the cool months, strange lights are said to flicker from deep within, though no power lines remain. Most unsettling are the reports from the 1980s and early 2000s. Hikers and railway enthusiasts who ventured too close and heard the distant rumble of a train. A train that, according to officials, no longer runs on that line. What train could that be? Could it simply be natural phenomena? Acoustic echoes? Wind through stone corridors? Geologists point to the region's limestone formations and high humidity, which can create odd reverberations. Historians suggest that unmarked graves, inevitable in wartime construction, contribute to the stories. Death lingering in the physical landscape, passed into legend. But others aren't so sure. In 1946, a British engineer named Charles Lennox, working for the Imperial Reconstruction Corps, wrote a private letter to his wife in Kent. In it, he described a visit to a disused tunnel in the Shan Hills. His team had been ordered to assess the site for possible reopening. Lennox described strange conditions: frost on the walls in midsummer, tools going missing, and workers refusing to enter past the halfway mark. He wrote, "There is something in there. Not something living, I think, but something watching. I felt it." Shortly after, Lennox was reassigned. The tunnel was never reopened. His letter was never published. Even Burmese railway officials today acknowledge the tunnel's existence, though few will speak of it publicly. The line, now considered defunct, is bypassed by modern routes. Entry is prohibited, not because of superstition, they say, but due to safety risks. Rockfall, structural instability, and yet, unofficially, some maintenance workers leave offerings, candles, rice, flowers, near certain sealed tunnel mouths. Just in case, they say. More recently, urban explorers and amateur ghost hunters have ventured to the site, guided by grainy British topographic maps and GPS coordinates cobbled together from colonial archives. A few claim to have reached the overgrown tunnel mouth, a black slit in the hillside, rimmed with ivy and carved stone, but none have gone far inside. One, a photographer from Mandalay, reported that his equipment failed within moments of entering. Batteries drained, compass spun. When he developed his film, one frame showed a faint blur, a glowing line across the trackbed. He has since refused to return. What, then, haunts the tunnels of Burma? Is it simply memory? The echo of colonial ambition carved into stone, now fading into moss and vine? Or is it something older, something awakened by the violence and grief of the past? Could the tunnels have become, in some sense, containers for that trauma? Spaces where time folds, where footsteps and voices repeat like trapped shadows? Or perhaps the real mystery is simpler still. How many lives were lost here, undocumented and unmourned? How much history remains buried in the dark, just beyond reach of the light? And what would we hear if we dared to listen closely one more time, deep within the tunnel of 8 echoes? As misted hills and haunted tunnels fade into memory, we return to something quieter, more clinical, yet no less disturbing. From jungles and railways to marble halls and filing cabinets, not all mysteries wear the mask of wilderness. Some are shelved behind polished doors, inside institutions built to preserve history, and sometimes to erase it. In the heart of London, just steps from the River Thames, stands a grand structure of stone and symmetry, the British Library's Asia, Pacific, and Africa collections, once the administrative brain of an empire that spanned continents. Before it became a repository of colonial memory, it was known simply as the India Office. It was here that the British Empire coordinated much of its control over the Indian subcontinent, from military campaigns and revenue systems to cultural programs and political appointments. In its time, the India Office generated a staggering volume of paperwork: ledgers, treaties, secret dispatches, maps, and letters. Millions of documents chronicling over 250 years of imperial rule. But then, something strange happened. As the empire withdrew from India in 1947 and the India Office was formally dissolved in 1948, tens of thousands of files were either destroyed, misplaced, or disappeared altogether. And no one can fully explain why. The official narrative is one of bureaucracy and burden. In the final years of empire, colonial administrators were instructed to reduce unnecessary documentation. Archiving guidelines issued by Whitehall advised departments to cull materials considered non-essential to future British interests. This policy was implemented in haste. According to surviving memos, India Office staff worked day and night in anticipation of handover. Boxes of files were transferred to various repositories, some to the British Museum, others to military archives, and many more to a mysterious internal program called Operation Legacy, designed to sanitize the colonial record. But somewhere along the way, entire categories of documents vanished. Among the missing, personal correspondences of key governors and viceroys, reports detailing intelligence operations during the Quit India movement, financial ledgers tied to wartime requisitions and industrial assets. And perhaps most intriguingly, dispatches related to indigenous uprisings that were never officially acknowledged. Why were these records not preserved? Some scholars argue it was routine weeding, a rational if regrettable byproduct of institutional downsizing. There simply wasn't space, they say, to keep everything. Much of the material may have been duplicated elsewhere, or considered too sensitive to maintain in public custody. But others remain skeptical. In the 1970s, historian Penderel Moon noted peculiar gaps in the archival timeline, periods in which key players appear to stop writing altogether. In particular, several high-level British officials, known for their meticulous reporting, seem to vanish from correspondence in the weeks leading up to partition. Did they really stop documenting events at the most critical moment of British withdrawal from India? Or were their reports quietly extracted and never returned? One former India office clerk, interviewed anonymously in the 1980s, described entire cabinets being locked and sent for review by unnamed officials. In one striking account, he recalled watching a trolley of bound ledgers, each marked "Restricted, Do Not Catalog," being wheeled out of the building in the early hours of a foggy October morning in 1949. They were never seen again. Years later, when the British Library assumed responsibility for the remaining files, archivists were surprised to find index numbers referencing documents that no longer existed, not simply misfiled, but actively removed. And while some missing items were likely transferred to diplomatic or intelligence holdings, where access is limited and controlled, others appear to have no forwarding trail at all, gone without explanation. More recently, researchers exploring the FCO's declassified migrated archives discovered a small batch of India office documents in an unrelated East African file. Among them was a 1946 memo describing post-independence contingency planning. One chilling phrase stood out: "Documentary assets of potential reputational hazard are to be evaluated for burn or deep store." What was meant by deep store? Where did such documents go? And who decided what constituted a hazard? Speculation, as ever, fills the void. Some believe the missing records contain evidence of war crimes, particularly during the suppression of revolts in Punjab and Bengal. Others suspect financial dealings, revealing how colonial wealth was extracted and funneled into British institutions in the twilight days of empire. Still others suggest something more elusive: that within those files lay the true story of how the empire functioned. Not the sanitized, administrative version offered in textbooks, but the mechanisms of coercion, subversion, and selective truth-telling that allowed one small island to dominate a subcontinent. Could the vanished records include evidence of collusion with princely states? Secret agreements never revealed to independent India? Or operations carried out under the guise of diplomacy never meant to see daylight? And if so, who made the call to erase them? Today, the India office records remain among the largest and most detailed colonial collections in the world. But their gaps are as telling as their contents. For every shelf of logged correspondence, there are silences, whole rooms of history missing. Scholars continue to file Freedom of Information requests. Whistleblowers occasionally leak redacted fragments, but the full extent of the disbanded records, what was lost, what was hidden, and what was quietly destroyed, remains unknown. So we ask, what was in those papers? What truths did they hold? Truths about empire, about resistance, about the very foundation of modern South Asia. Were they lost to neglect or erased by design? And if the walls of the India office could speak, beyond the dust and the silence, what stories might they still be trying to tell? From the faded pages of missing Imperial archives, we turn now to a figure whose name is still etched in stone, literally and metaphorically, across southern Africa. Cecil John Rhodes, empire builder, diamond magnate, and the man whose dreams stretched from Cape to Cairo. But while history often frames his life in bold strokes, ambition, expansion, controversy, the circumstances surrounding his death remain oddly muted. Officially natural, unquestioned, yet quietly strange. He died in 1902, at the age of just 48. And the final weeks of his life raise more questions than they answer. Rhodes died not in the halls of British Parliament or among the manicured gardens of Oxford, but in a villa near Muizenberg on the rugged coast of South Africa's Cape Colony. The villa, named the Woolsack, nestled against the slopes of Table Mountain, overlooked the churning Atlantic waters, its windows often fogged with sea mist. Inside, the man who had once controlled vast tracts of territory, commanded armies, and brokered treaties lay confined to a bed. By all accounts, the final days were painful. He struggled to breathe, his limbs swollen, his speech slurred. His doctors diagnosed heart failure, a condition he had reportedly battled for years. But no post-mortem was ever conducted, no death mask was made, and no official report has ever surfaced explaining precisely what caused the sudden and rapid decline of one of the most powerful men in the British Empire. Rhodes's health had been deteriorating since the late 1890s. He had suffered from fatigue, chest pain, and bouts of mental confusion. Some attributed it to stress, his failed political maneuverings, the aftermath of the Jameson raid, and growing criticism from both Britain and the colonies. Others suggested kidney disease or an undiagnosed autoimmune condition, yet letters from those close to him paint a more complex picture. In one correspondence from a confidant, Dr. Leander Starr Jameson, dated March 1902, just days before Rhodes's death, the doctor notes that Cecil's breathing halts oddly, not in the manner of standard cardiac distress. He seems occasionally absent from himself. Absent from himself. What did that mean? Was it simply the poetic musing of a concerned friend, or a subtle indication that something more unnatural was unfolding? There were whispers, even then, that Rhodes had not died of heart disease, but of poisoning. That a trusted associate, possibly fearing Rhodes was about to change his will or reveal sensitive information, hastened his end. This theory, while never substantiated, hinges on the strange fact that Rhodes had updated his will several times in the months leading to his death, making sudden revisions to his extensive holdings in De Beers, to the terms of the Rhodes Scholarship, and to the ownership of lands in what is now Zimbabwe. Each version was more politically cautious than the last, as if he were under pressure, as if someone was watching. Another mystery lies in Rhodes's final hours. According to household staff, he asked not to be disturbed by clergy, unusual for a man of his background and time. He reportedly murmured phrases in his sleep, switching between English, Dutch, and an African language that one servant claimed was Shona. Rhodes was known for his commanding nature, but in those final hours he appeared disoriented, frightened. One nurse later claimed he kept asking, "What have I done? What did I bring here?" To what was he referring? Was it the violence of colonization? The bloodshed his policies unleashed across Matabeleland and Mashonaland? Or something else, something personal, hidden from the public record? In the weeks following his death, the woolsack was swiftly sealed. Several crates of personal papers were removed by agents of the British South Africa Company. Many of these have never been recovered. Some were reportedly destroyed. Others, according to a 1920 inventory, were held under private custodianship for reasons of state. Even the location of his burial was steeped in ritual. Rhodes had ordered long before his death that his body be interred at a place called World's View atop a granite hill in the Matobo Hills of southern Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe. The site, sacred to local communities, was historically used for spiritual communion and burial. Why would Rhodes, an avowed imperialist, choose such a place? Was it a gesture of control, a final claim on land and legacy? Or did he believe, as some colonial-era writings suggest, that the hill held a unique energy, something timeless and possibly protective? Local oral traditions tell of strange occurrences after his body was brought to the hill. Animals, usually absent from the summit, gathered silently during the night of his burial. A lightning storm struck a nearby peak, and then there are the accounts, mostly anecdotal, of travelers in the 1920s and 30s who reported seeing a man in white walking along the path to the tomb during moonless nights. No evidence supports these stories, and yet they persist. Could Rhodes, in his final days, have been confronting more than just illness? Was he burdened by the moral weight of empire? Was there fear in his final hours? Of judgment? Of secrets exposed? Of consequences not yet paid? Or are these simply projections, modern imaginings laid atop a man whose power, ambition, and contradictions still haunt the landscapes he helped shape? We may never know what truly ended Cecil Rhodes's life. The medical records are gone, the testimonies are scattered, the legacy is tangled. But the questions remain. Did Rhodes die as history claims? Of natural causes, in quiet decline? Or did something deeper unfold in those final moments, something deliberately veiled? And in a world still reckoning with the empire he helped forge, might the full truth of his death, like so much of his life, still lie buried in shadow? The landscape of central Kenya is vast and unforgiving. Rolling hills of dense forest stretch into the haze, cut by red earth tracks and shadowed by ancient fig trees. At dusk, the light here turns amber, a soft golden hue that blankets the land with silence. But beneath this serene surface, the soil remembers. In the 1950s, it ran with fear, resistance, and blood. It was here, deep in the Aberdare Range and among the Kikuyu heartlands, that one of the most brutal and concealed episodes of British colonial history unfolded, the Mau Mau Uprising. And somewhere, if the accounts are to be believed, within this hidden war, a series of handwritten diaries vanished, their contents unknown, their existence contested, their fate unresolved. The Mau Mau Uprising officially began in 1952, though its roots stretch far earlier, woven into the injustices of land dispossession, forced labor, and the erosion of traditional Kenyan life under British colonial rule. Declared an emergency by British authorities, the rebellion was met with overwhelming military force. Thousands of Kikuyu men and women were detained without trial. Entire villages were relocated to protected camps. Forest fighters were hunted, tortured, and, in many cases, executed. Yet the true scale and nature of these operations remained obscure for decades, until a whisper surfaced in the 1980s that during the height of the conflict, a small number of British colonial officers and perhaps a handful of detained Kenyan nationalists had kept detailed personal diaries. Diaries that chronicled not just troop movements or political debates, but unfiltered accounts of interrogations, secret policies, and moments of ethical crisis. And then, inexplicably, those diaries disappeared. The first hint came from a former British intelligence officer, interviewed under condition of anonymity in 1983. He described having seen a leather-bound journal in 1957, written in a neat, cursive hand by a district commissioner stationed near Nyeri. The diary, he said, contained entries about so-called black sites, unofficial detention centers operating outside military protocol. He claimed the diary was slated for handover to the Kenya National Archives after independence in 1963. But when he later searched for it, there was no record, not even a catalog entry. Other stories followed. A Kenyan archivist, working in Nairobi during the 1970s, recalled a similar notebook, this one in Gikuyu, said to have been smuggled out of a detention camp by a former Mau Mau general. It reportedly contained codes, burial locations, and detailed testimony of torture sessions. She was instructed not to process it. Days later, the document vanished from her desk. She never saw it again. Were these stories simply misremembered? Could the lost diaries be a myth born from overlapping memories and suppressed histories? Or were they deliberately removed, cleansed from official narratives, either to protect reputations or to obscure truths too damaging to disclose? These questions gained urgency in 2011, when a landmark legal case against the British government, filed by Mau Mau veterans, unearthed thousands of secret colonial files hidden for decades at a Foreign Office facility in Hanslope Park, Buckinghamshire. The so-called migrated archives detailed systematic abuses, beatings, castrations, and executions, long denied by officials. Many of the files referenced daily reports, letters, and personal logs of colonial administrators. But the logs themselves? Still missing. Why? One theory holds that the diaries were destroyed during the mass purge of colonial records in the lead-up to decolonization, part of the broader Operation Legacy program, intended to prevent embarrassing materials from falling into post-independence hands. According to a declassified memorandum from 1961, British administrators in Kenya were instructed to destroy documents that could embarrass HMG, Her Majesty's government, the police, or public servants. Diaries, especially personal ones, were considered dangerous, unfiltered accounts that couldn't be easily edited or denied. And yet, not all destruction orders were carried out. Some officers kept documents, perhaps out of loyalty, perhaps out of guilt, or perhaps for insurance. Could the diaries still exist, locked away in private collections? Stored in attics, trunks, or family safes in Britain, far from the soil in which they were written. In 2016, a researcher at Oxford's Bodleian Library uncovered a reference to a field journal, Mau Mau Emergency, Central Province, 1954, in the footnotes of an unpublished thesis from the early 1970s. The journal's location was listed simply as private estate. The estate's identity remains unclear. Despite repeated inquiries, the journal has not surfaced. Others believe the key may lie in oral history. Kenyan elders who survived the emergency still speak in cautious tones of notes passed between detainees, some written in charcoal on scraps of cloth, others committed to memory and later copied in hiding. One elder, in a 2020 interview, described watching a friend write every night in a pocketbook. He wrote even when they beat him. He said, "They must not control the story." What happened to that pocketbook? No one knows. So where are the lost diaries of the Mau Mau? Do they rest, gathering dust in forgotten boxes? Were they deliberately hidden to shield the full extent of Britain's colonial response? Or were they destroyed, vanished like so many voices of resistance, before the truth could be passed on? And perhaps the larger question lingers not in their fate, but in what they represent. The memory of empire not as a grand abstraction, but as lived experience, painful, messy, human. What would those pages tell us if we found them? And are we prepared for what they might reveal? As the shadows of empire stretch from distant colonies to the heart of England itself, some of its most curious mysteries unfold not in far-flung territories, but on its own rain-slicked cobbled streets. It is the 1880s in southern England. The soot of industry hangs heavy in the air. Streets buzz with a new kind of disorder, not only from poverty and hunger, but from voices rising against it. Marches, banners, sermons in the open air. And among them, a strange, unsettling presence. A group parades down the street in grotesque mimicry. Skulls painted on banners, mock military uniforms, brass instruments blaring drunken tunes. Their slogan is simple: if crude, beef, beer, and baka. They are the skeleton army. And yet, despite their chaos, this group, largely dismissed as a band of unruly working-class youths, would for a time be protected, even encouraged, by elements of the British establishment. Their targets? Not revolutionaries or foreign enemies, but the Salvation Army. And what followed remains one of the strangest, least discussed domestic mysteries of Victorian Britain. The Skeleton Army emerged in towns like Portsmouth, Worthing, and Exeter, industrial hubs experiencing rapid social upheaval. By 1881, the Salvation Army had begun to make its mark in these communities, preaching abstinence from alcohol and a life of moral reform. They held processions with drums and brass bands, distributing pamphlets and delivering public addresses against drinking and vice. To many of the local poor, struggling to survive in overcrowded housing and numbing labor, the Army's message was both hopeful and suffocating. Pubs, centers of social life, saw their business decline. Brewers, landlords, and drinkers alike grew resentful. And then came the skeletons. They formed spontaneously, some say, out of mockery. Young men in skull masks, banging tin pans and marching ahead of salvationist processions, jeering their slogans, throwing rotten food. They often carried banners with inverted symbols, coffins, crossbones, and the phrase "blood and thunder," mocking the Army's "blood and fire" crest. But their antics soon turned violent. Stones were thrown, Salvationists were beaten, women were dragged through the streets, meetings were disrupted, instruments smashed, banners torn, and in town after town, something strange happened. Local authorities stood by and did nothing. In fact, in some cases, the police arrested the victims, members of the Salvation Army, while letting skeletons go free. Why? The official explanation is simple. Salvation Army marches were accused of obstructing traffic, disturbing the peace, and violating public order. Their refusal to pay local fines or heed restrictions put them in conflict with magistrates. By contrast, the Skeleton Army, though unruly, was framed as spontaneous, non-political, and mostly harmless. But others suspected a more deliberate hand at work. In Portsmouth, leaked correspondence suggested that prominent brewery owners had funded the skeletons, supplying beer, uniforms, and transportation to disrupt marches. In Worthing, the mayor himself was accused of turning a blind eye, despite multiple injuries caused by skeleton violence. The Salvation Army's own internal records speak of coordinated efforts, skeletons appearing suddenly in large numbers in towns they'd never been seen before. Groups with military-style discipline, clear chain of command, and a peculiar immunity to legal consequences. Were they just rowdy mobs? Or was something else, something organized, behind their campaign? Some historians have drawn parallels between the Skeleton Army and other informal counter-protest movements used throughout the empire to discredit dissent. Much like colonial authorities who quietly encouraged native collaborators to suppress resistance movements, the Skeleton Army may have served as a domestic version, deniable, expendable, and effective. But there's more. Several skeleton leaders simply disappeared from the historical record. No court appearances, no later census entries, no known deaths. One in particular, Captain Skull of Bath, was arrested in 1884 after inciting a riot. The Salvation Army tracked his trial closely, hoping for public accountability. But then the case was dropped. He was released without explanation. After that, no one heard of him again. And then there's the curious case of the missing police records. Between 1883 and 1886, a series of documents related to Skeleton Army activity, arrests, complaints, riot logs, went missing from local archives in 4 separate towns. Researchers attempting to access these files decades later found redacted pages or blank catalog entries. Some blamed clerical error. Others pointed to deliberate removal. Why would these records be expunged? There are also lingering rumors of deeper connections. A 1902 journal entry by a retired Salvationist in Leeds claimed he had overheard two skeleton leaders in 1884 referencing a higher hand in Westminster, paying them for jobs well done. He was never able to verify what he heard. Fringe theories even suggest a psychological warfare experiment, Victorian social control in the early stages of formalized intelligence work. There is no proof of this, but the idea lingers in the silence that surrounds these events. Eventually, the skeleton army faded. By the late 1880s, public tolerance for their violence wore thin. Sympathy shifted toward the Salvationists, especially after the death of a 17-year-old girl during a riot in Exeter. Parliament began to debate legal protections for religious demonstrations, and the skeletons dissolved into history. But no formal inquiry was ever launched. No political figures were named. No funding networks traced. The role of the police, the magistrates, the industrial backers, all quietly set aside. Why? Were the skeletons simply a rough response to moral reform, a manifestation of class resentment and cultural tension? Or were they something else? A tool employed, quietly and temporarily, by the empire's own hand to manage dissent on its home soil? Perhaps the most unsettling mystery is not the skeleton army's violence, but the absence of consequence, the empty files, the vanishing names, the systemic silence. Was the skeleton army an embarrassing footnote, deliberately forgotten, or a glimpse into how power truly functioned in the twilight years of British imperial confidence? And if a band of masked hooligans could operate with impunity on the streets of Victorian England, who else and what else was operating in the shadows? In the heart of West Africa, the morning sun rises slowly over the remnants of a once great kingdom. Dense canopies rustle with the stir of birdsong, and the scent of red dust lingers in the air. Here, beneath the tropical skies of what is now Ghana, lie the echoes of the Ashanti Empire, an empire of warriors, gold, and intricate tradition. At its height, the Ashanti Confederacy rivaled European empires in organization, wealth, and culture. Their oral histories were vast, but not all their knowledge lived only in memory. Among the Ashanti elites, it is said, were scrolls, parchments, or palm leaf manuscripts, recording dynastic genealogies, sacred lore, and accounts of contact with the spiritual realm. And then, during the final days of the 19th century, in the wake of British conquest, those scrolls vanished. Were they destroyed, hidden, or quietly removed to imperial vaults overseas? No one knows for certain, but for a civilization that recorded most of its history through griots and oral tradition, the loss of any written record, however rare, casts a long and mysterious shadow. The story begins with the Fourth Anglo-Ashanti War of 1895 to 1896. At that time, British forces, under Governor William Maxwell and Colonel Francis Scott, marched inland from the coast toward Kumasi, the spiritual and administrative center of the Ashanti realm. Their goal was not only political control, but symbolic domination, capturing the Golden Stool, the sacred throne of the Ashanti believed to house the soul of the nation. The campaign was swift. King Prempeh I, seeking to avoid bloodshed, surrendered without resistance. Kumasi was occupied, its palace looted, and its king exiled to the Seychelles. Among the items taken by British forces were golden artifacts, ceremonial swords, and carved regalia, now displayed in museums across Britain. But, according to reports by both colonial officers and local eyewitnesses, there were also documents, bundled scrolls housed in carved wooden cases, some wrapped in leather, others in embroidered cloth. The scrolls, it was said, were stored in a private chamber near the palace compound, accessible only to the highest priests and royal scribes. That chamber was ransacked, the scrolls never seen again. Official British reports make little mention of any such items. In Governor Maxwell's records, There is reference to papers of native character and indigenous record-keeping, but no details are given. A note in the 1896 inventory of looted goods mentions textiles and scrolls, though the scrolls are not described further and disappear from the documentation soon after. This silence has fueled over a century of speculation. If the scrolls were destroyed during the sacking of Kumasi, why was there no record of fire or deliberate burning? Loot was carefully catalogued, especially gold, but these scrolls received no public acknowledgement. Were they deemed unimportant, or were they removed for another purpose? One British military officer, Captain Harry Lewis, wrote in a personal letter that strange manuscripts of native design were found in the king's storeroom and handed over to an intelligence clerk for study. That clerk, a man named Robert Templeton, is a shadowy figure in colonial archives, appearing briefly in military manifests before resigning his post the following year. Templeton disappeared from historical records shortly thereafter. Where did he go, and what, if anything, did he take with him? Ashanti oral historians have long insisted the scrolls were more than mere records. They were sacred. According to some griots, the scrolls contained spiritual formulas, chronicles of the Golden Stool's creation, and even coded maps of buried regalia. One elder described them as the breath of our ancestors, captured in ink. But Ashanti society did not typically use written language for spiritual transmission. So what, then, were these scrolls? Some scholars propose they may have been Arabic-influenced texts, created through centuries of contact with Islamic traders from the Sahel. Indeed, parts of Ghana were linked to trans-Saharan networks where writing was more common. Others suggest they were court records written in Adinkra symbols, an ideographic script used to communicate philosophical concepts and proverbs. If so, deciphering them would require knowledge that was already vanishing by the late 19th century. Were these scrolls ever intended to be read by foreigners? Then there is the matter of their sudden reappearance, if only in rumor. In 1921, a French ethnographer named Jacques Martin, traveling through British West Africa, recorded a curious anecdote. While visiting a collector in Accra, he claimed to have seen an old Ashanti scroll, faded and partially illegible, with geometric patterns and strange script. The collector refused to sell or identify its source. Martin's notes were lost for decades, only resurfacing in 1974 in a Paris archive. No image of the scroll survives. In 1953, a Ghanaian researcher working with the British Museum claimed to have seen a scroll fragment mislabeled as Sudanese manuscript, unknown. The item disappeared from the storage catalog 2 years later during a major reorganization of African collections. And in 2007, a private estate auction in Kent listed an untranslated Ashanti document, provenance unknown. The listing was removed before the auction took place. When pressed, the estate's legal representative offered no comment. Is it possible that at least one scroll still exists, perhaps in a private archive, misfiled, or deliberately hidden? Speculative theories abound. Some claim British intelligence forces deliberately removed the scrolls due to references to divine kingship or prophecies that undermined colonial legitimacy. Others believe that Freemasons within the colonial structure may have taken interest in symbols that echoed esoteric iconography, an unlikely but persistent theory. More grounded is the notion that the scrolls were treated as mere curiosities by soldiers who lacked the context to understand their importance. They may have been taken home as trophies, sold quietly, or discarded. But what if the scrolls were hidden not by the British, but by the Ashanti themselves? One oral tradition speaks of a scribe who, during the final days of Prempeh's reign, fled the palace with a wrapped bundle of sacred texts. He was never seen again, but his lineage, it's said, still guards something in the forests north of Lake Bosumtwi. No physical evidence supports this tale. Yet it persists, whispered among descendants who believe the scrolls will return when the stool is threatened once more. So where are the Ashanti scrolls? Were they destroyed in the chaos of war, dismissed and discarded by men who did not understand them? Were they looted, secreted away to private collections, locked in libraries under false names? Or were they saved, hidden by their own people, kept safe for a future that has yet to arrive? In the tangled legacy of empire, not all losses are material. Some are stories, half remembered, half erased, waiting in the silence of archives and the shadows of memory. And as long as those scrolls remain missing, a question lingers at the edge of the record. What knowledge was meant to be forgotten? High in the Himalayas, where the air thins and the snow never fully melts, lies a land once sealed off from the world. Tibet, remote, sacred, elusive. Its monasteries cling to cliffs like secrets carved in stone, and its wind-swept plateaus echo with the chants of monks and the distant call of yak herders. But beneath the spiritual stillness and the jagged grandeur of its mountains, a hidden current once stirred, one of espionage, maps, disguises, and imperial ambition. In the twilight of the 19th century and the early decades of the 20th, British India regarded Tibet not as a mystery to revere, but as a question to solve, a buffer zone, a blind spot, and perhaps a threat. What followed was a series of covert missions so discreet that, even now, the full record remains clouded in uncertainty. Their names barely appear in textbooks. Their objectives are only partially understood. But what exactly were the British doing in Tibet, and why? Our story begins with a map, or rather, the absence of one. In the late 1800s, as the British consolidated their control over India, they encountered a problem. The northern frontier remained largely unmapped, a blank space beyond the high passes of Sikkim and Ladakh. While London fixated on Russian advances in Central Asia, the so-called Great Game, British officers in Simla and Calcutta grew increasingly anxious about what lay beyond those silent mountains. Could Russia be courting the Dalai Lama? Could Chinese influence in Lhasa be masking other interests? Or was Tibet, in its isolation, hiding its own intentions? To answer these questions, maps were needed. But Tibet did not welcome foreign surveyors. European travelers were forbidden, and Tibetan border guards had grown wary of intruders. So the British turned to an unlikely class of explorer, Indian agents trained in secret and sent into the unknown. They were called pundits, not scholars in the traditional sense, but native surveyors recruited from the hill tribes and elite circles of British India. Men like Nain Singh Rawat and Kishan Singh, educated, multilingual, and deeply loyal. These men learned to walk with precisely measured paces, to count steps in their heads, and to conceal surveying equipment inside prayer wheels, rosaries, and walking staffs. Disguised as pilgrims or traders, they crossed into Tibet alone, risking execution if discovered. Their mission: to chart the terrain, identify routes, and observe fortifications. Nain Singh, perhaps the most famous of them, spent years disguised as a monk, memorizing entire river systems and palace layouts. He secretly mapped the route to Lhasa and back, an achievement many believed impossible. But these missions were not merely geographic. The pundits were asked to collect rumors, note troop movements, study cultural customs, and on occasion deliver coded messages. Their reports were often handwritten in cipher, their movements concealed even from colonial bureaucrats. And yet, despite their remarkable service, their stories would remain classified, tucked away in British intelligence archives for decades. Why? By the early 20th century, Tibet's isolationism became more than a cartographic nuisance. it became a political risk. In 1903, the situation escalated into full-blown intervention. Under the leadership of Colonel Francis Younghusband, a British expedition, framed as a diplomatic mission, marched from India into Tibet with nearly 3,000 troops. Ostensibly, their goal was to ensure open trade and prevent perceived Russian influence. But what followed was far from diplomatic. The British advanced steadily toward Lhasa, encountering scattered Tibetan resistance. At Guru, a small village en route, the mission turned deadly. A force of Tibetan monks and farmers, armed mostly with matchlocks and spears, faced off against modern British firepower. Over 600 Tibetans were killed in a matter of hours. The massacre shocked even some British officers. When the mission finally reached Lhasa in 1904, the Dalai Lama had already fled. A treaty was forced upon the Tibetan regents, one that imposed trade rights, indemnities, and British oversight. But the deeper motivations behind the invasion were never fully explained. Was it fear of Russian agents, the desire to test Tibetan defenses, or something more obscure? In the years that followed, whispers emerged of continued British intelligence activity in Tibet, missions not acknowledged by Parliament and largely absent from military records. During World War I, and later again in the 1930s, British India maintained what it called a political officer in Sikkim, ostensibly a diplomatic post, but in practice a key link in a chain of intelligence gathering stretching from Nepal to Bhutan. Some of these officers, including the enigmatic Frederick Bailey, doubled as spies. Bailey, it is said, once posed as a Russian agent in order to infiltrate Bolshevik circles in Central Asia and passed through Tibetan territories under multiple disguises. What was Britain really looking for in those mountains? Oil, mineral wealth, military advantage, or were there stranger motives? Over the years, more speculative theories have taken root. One suggests that British officers, fascinated by theosophy and Eastern mysticism, believed Tibet held ancient secrets. It is true that in the early 20th century, some British elites became obsessed with ideas of hidden wisdom and Atlantean knowledge. Tibet was portrayed in certain circles as a lost archive of pre-Christian spirituality, guarded by an elite monastic class. While mainstream historians often dismiss these ideas as Orientalist fantasy, there remains the curious fact that some British missions into Tibet were accompanied not just by geographers, but by linguists, archaeologists, and scholars of comparative religion. In 1912, a cache of Tibetan manuscripts was recovered from the Dunhuang caves in western China, sparking renewed interest in Buddhist esotericism and lost histories. Some in British circles feared that these manuscripts, if properly studied, might reframe world history itself. Could the secret missions have been, in part, about knowledge, not just territory? Others point to more practical, if still unacknowledged, motives. Tibet's position between China, Russia, and British India made it the perfect surveillance zone. High mountain passes could serve as strategic choke points. Rivers that flowed from the Tibetan plateau nourished the plains of Asia, making water rights a growing concern. British geologists quietly surveyed Tibetan soil for uranium and other rare minerals, years before their importance would be globally recognized. And then there are the missing reports. In 1935, a British expedition, led by a team of geographers and engineers, spent months mapping the Sangpo River Valley. Their final report, submitted to the India office, has never been found. When researchers requested access to the expedition's files in the 1970s, they were told they had been accidentally misplaced. How does an entire field report, complete with photographs and specimen logs, simply vanish? Today, much of Tibet's colonial history remains contested. British involvement is often framed in terms of maps and treaties. But in the margins of empire, where intelligence meets mystery, the story grows far more complex. Who authorized the most covert missions? What knowledge did the pundits bring back that was never disclosed? And what artifacts, be they religious, strategic, or political, were quietly extracted from monasteries, caves, and mountaintop shrines. Even now, British archives contain classified Tibetan files, marked as restricted under national interest. Scholars suspect these include first-hand accounts of secret crossings, encrypted correspondences, and items deemed too sensitive for public disclosure. What do they contain? Why are they still sealed? And what part of the empire's Himalayan shadow has yet to be fully brought to light? The mountains remain. The wind still whispers across the high passes, and somewhere, in the dust of forgotten chambers and the folds of bureaucratic silence, the secrets of the empire's missions in Tibet may still lie waiting to be uncovered. But until then, we are left only with fragments, rumors, and one lingering question. What was Britain really searching for on the roof of the world? Just off the eastern coast of India, surrounded by the restless waters of the Bay of Bengal, lies a scattering of emerald islands lost to time. The Andaman archipelago, dense with rainforest, distant from the mainland, and whispering with salt and monsoon wind, was once a place few dared to venture. Today, its beaches draw tourists seeking tropical serenity, but beneath the palms and vines, there are structures that hint at a darker past. In the heart of Port Blair, half concealed by thick foliage and the weight of silence, stands a brooding monument of colonial punishment, the cellular jail. Built in the early 20th century, its radiating wings and high watchtowers seem almost designed to extinguish hope. But long before it became a symbol of imperial cruelty, the Andaman Islands were already known as a place of banishment, chosen not for reform, but for forgetting. And some say, the island remembers. The British established their first penal settlement in the Andamans in 1858, following the brutal suppression of the Indian Rebellion of 1857. Thousands of mutineers and suspected dissidents were rounded up and exiled. The archipelago, isolated and malaria-ridden, was seen as the perfect site for a natural prison. Port Blair became the administrative center of what would eventually grow into one of the most infamous penal colonies in the British Empire. In its early years, the colony was less a prison than a death sentence. Prisoners were forced into hard labor, clearing jungle, constructing barracks, and enduring brutal punishments. Food was scarce, disease rampant, and guards indifferent. Escape was nearly impossible. Thick forests, shark-infested waters, and hostile indigenous tribes saw to that. Records from the time speak of mass graves and nameless dead. But it is the things not recorded, the rumors, the silences, the disappearances, that give this place its enduring eeriness. What makes the Andaman penal colony so unsettling is not just what happened, but what lingers. Former inmates, long after their release, spoke of strange happenings in the dead of night. Footsteps echoing in empty corridors, whispered voices that seemed to seep through the walls, a chill in the air that defied the island heat. Some described waking to see faces at their cell doors, faces of men they knew had died years before. Were these hallucinations born from trauma, the product of isolation and despair? Or was something else at work? Even British administrators noted the colony's atmosphere. Sir Richard Temple, during his 1880 visit, wrote of a heaviness to the air, as though the jungle itself bore witness. He wasn't alone. One jailer, in an 1893 letter, claimed to hear cries from the sea, though no boats were near and no prisoners had escaped. The reports were never investigated officially. They were simply filed. Then there's the matter of the missing registry. In 1912, an internal audit revealed that dozens of prisoner records had vanished. Names, sentences, entire lives lost to bureaucratic oblivion. The explanation offered was clerical error, or possibly a cyclone-damaged archive. But some historians suspect something stranger. Among the missing were political prisoners, activists, poets, intellectuals. Men who had defied the Raj not with weapons, but with words. Could their erasure have been intentional? Or were they victims of something darker, something unrecorded? And what of the solitary cells, narrow, suffocating enclosures designed for sensory deprivation? Some were said to have been permanently sealed. Why? No official answer exists. Local legend holds that certain cells became uninhabitable. Prisoners would go mad within days, refuse food, speak in tongues, or tear at their own skin. One particularly grim story tells of a prisoner who scratched hundreds of symbols into the stone walls of his cell before vanishing altogether. No body, no record of release. The symbols were said to be indecipherable, resembling no known script. The cell, it said, was bricked up within the month. Visitors to the abandoned wings of the cellular jail today often report an oppressive atmosphere. Cold spots, flickering lights. Guides walk with reverence through the old corridors, avoiding certain areas without explanation. Tourists speak of sudden nausea or the inexplicable urge to leave. Rational minds point to structural decay, mold, and the power of suggestion. And yet, the stories persist. In 1996, a documentary crew filming a history special in Port Blair reported multiple equipment failures while recording near the gallows chamber. Batteries drained inexplicably. Audio captured what appeared to be faint chanting, though no one present heard anything at the time. Local tribes, who have long resisted contact with outsiders, speak of the land itself being spoiled. Among the Nicobarese and the Great Andamanese, there are oral traditions warning against building or sleeping near the old prison sites. Not because of spirits per se, but because some wrong was done and it still walks. What that wrong was, they do not say. More recently, classified British documents declassified in 2012 revealed that the penal colony was also used for psychological experiments, though the details remain vague. One file mentions a program called Observation Series C, testing solitary confinement's effects over extended periods. The test subjects? Political prisoners, often those deemed charismatic or dangerous not for violence, but for their ideas. How many were subjected to these trials remains unknown. And then, curiously, the program ends without conclusion. No final report. No results. Just a blank page. And silence. The mystery deepens when we examine the timeline of the colony's dissolution. In 1938, with rising political pressure, the British began transferring prisoners back to the mainland. But rather than dismantle the cellular jail, they left large portions abandoned. Whole wings were left to rot, doors still bolted, personal items untouched. Why preserve so much and document so little? Was it simply imperial neglect, or did the British fear what they had built? After Indian independence in 1947, the jail was partially demolished, then declared a national memorial. Today, it stands as a monument to colonial oppression, but also as a structure that refuses to fully fade. Its stones bear the weight of thousands of voices, some remembered, many lost, and perhaps a few that still speak when no one is listening. So what truly haunts the Andaman penal colony? Is it the collective trauma of a brutal past, echoing through time and memory? Is it the unexplained, the files that vanished, the cells that were sealed, the symbols that defy translation? Or is it something deeper, something the British themselves could never quite understand or name? Even now, the wind that blows through the ruined wings of cellular jail seems to carry questions, and as night falls on Port Blair, as the waves lap against the forgotten docks, one cannot help but wonder, what remains imprisoned in a prison no longer used? Beneath an endless sky where clouds hang low over waters that shimmer like molten glass, there lies a stretch of ocean that has inspired wonder, fear, and fascination for centuries. The air here is thick with salt, movement, and mystery. Known to many as the Bermuda Triangle, this region of the Atlantic is framed by Miami, Bermuda, and San Juan. But names and coordinates can do little to capture what sailors have long whispered, that something about these waters feels different. It is here, in this vast and often deceptively calm expanse, that ships vanish, compasses fail, and radio signals fall to silence. And the British Royal Navy, masters of the seas for over 400 years, has not been immune to its enigmas. Officially, the Royal Navy does not acknowledge the Bermuda Triangle as a phenomenon. There are no flagged regions on nautical charts, no special advisories issued for its triangular boundaries. Yet historically, incidents involving British vessels and personnel in this area remain curiously numerous and curiously underdocumented. To understand the British entanglement with the Bermuda Triangle, one must begin not with disappearance, but with presence. Bermuda, the island at the triangle's northern point, has long been a key strategic outpost. The British claimed it in 1609, when the ship Sea Venture, carrying settlers to Jamestown, was wrecked on its reefs during a violent storm. That event, often romanticized in literature, including Shakespeare's The Tempest, marked the beginning of Britain's maritime relationship with this mysterious region. Bermuda soon became the Gibraltar of the West. Its deep harbors and isolation made it an ideal naval base, from which the Royal Navy projected its influence throughout the Caribbean and Atlantic. But despite its tactical importance, many who served here recorded unease. Journals from as early as the 1700s describe strange lights at sea, disoriented birds, and magnetic anomalies. Some officers dismissed these as tropical illusions or symptoms of heat stroke. Others noted them more solemnly, detailing incidents of failed compasses, time loss, and even hallucinations. What explains these accounts? Atmospheric phenomena? Solar flares? Or something more elusive lurking beneath the waves? One of the earliest documented disappearances occurred in 1781, when the HMS Atalanta, a training vessel, set sail from Bermuda to England with 300 aboard, many of them teenage cadets. It never arrived. No distress signal, no debris, just absence. Some blamed storms, others pirates. But the Atlantic had seen both before, and this was a ship of the Crown, sailing in peacetime, in good weather, with no known enemies in the region. There was no inquiry, no public scandal. The loss was recorded as unfortunate, the sea blamed as always. But what if it wasn't only the sea? As the centuries passed and British control ebbed across the globe, Bermuda's role as a colonial stronghold remained. During World War II and into the Cold War, it served as a vital listening post and transatlantic relay. The Royal Navy maintained joint operations with American forces, tracking Soviet submarines, intercepting signals, and surveying what some classified documents referred to cryptically as unexplained maritime conditions. Declassified communications from 1952 mention a Royal Navy frigate, the HMS Affray, engaging in maneuvers in the western Atlantic near Bermuda, only to lose all contact. The ship would later be discovered near the English Channel, sunk under unexplained circumstances. While the vessel was far from Bermuda at the time of its final resting, some researchers have questioned the discrepancy in reports regarding its last confirmed position, suggesting a possible transatlantic link in its disappearance and misidentification. Did the ship transit through the triangle? Was it carrying sensitive equipment or operating under orders that remain classified? The official story holds, but the questions linger. Perhaps the most chilling mystery tied to British naval presence in the Bermuda Triangle involves aircraft rather than ships. In 1955, a Royal Air Force Avro Shackleton, an aircraft designed for long-range maritime patrol, was flying a joint mission with the Royal Navy from Bermuda to the Caribbean. Roughly 2 hours into its flight, all contact was lost. No wreckage was ever found. No emergency signal was sent. What makes the case especially eerie is that 2 hours prior to takeoff, ground staff reported erratic compass behavior in the hangar. Instruments spun aimlessly, then returned to normal without intervention. A faulty electrical field, perhaps, or something else. The Air Ministry closed the case quietly. Explanations for Bermuda Triangle anomalies are, of course, plentiful. Methane gas eruptions disrupting buoyancy, rogue waves overwhelming ships, sudden weather shifts, electronic fogs that scramble instrumentation. These are grounded, measurable phenomena. The Royal Navy, like most official bodies, leans toward these answers. But there are holes. Why do some disappearances lack even a single trace of debris? Why are logbooks, when recovered, often missing final entries? And why, in an era of satellite surveillance, do certain disappearances still resist explanation? In 1971, a British naval researcher stationed at Bermuda recorded a series of sonar anomalies beneath a quiet sector of ocean southwest of the island. Echoes returned at impossible depths, then vanished. The data was sent to the Hydrographic Office in Taunton and never released. When questioned years later, the researcher simply said, "It was not what we expected to find." He offered no further comment. Some speculative theories push beyond science and into myth. Ancient Atlantean energy fields, time distortions, alien interference, electromagnetic portals. Others are more subtle, suggesting the Bermuda Triangle is not a fixed location, but a phenomenon that follows patterns of celestial alignment or undersea tectonic flux. That it is not a place, but a condition, one that reveals itself only when all elements align. Could the Royal Navy, with its centuries of accumulated logs, have noticed something the public does not know? Could the archival silence around key events suggest deliberate omission? Or is it simply that the sea, even after all these years, still defies us? Today, Bermuda remains a British overseas territory. Its role as a naval base has diminished, but traces of its military past remain. Abandoned tunnels, rusting radar stations, sealed vaults buried beneath coral and brush. Locals speak of areas where radios go silent. Fishermen avoid certain channels, not because they are shallow, but because they are wrong. The air feels too still, the sky too heavy. And while the Royal Navy no longer sails the region in strength, its shadow remains. In training materials, in forgotten reports, in memorial plaques honoring ships that never returned. So what lies at the heart of this mystery? A natural anomaly waiting to be explained by science? A centuries-old secret held by empires and guarded by silence? Or simply the ocean itself, deep, ancient, and unknowable? As the tides continue to turn and new technologies peer ever deeper beneath the surface, perhaps one day we will know. Or perhaps some mysteries are not meant to be solved. The early morning sun rises slowly over Kolkata, casting long shadows through the tangled branches of ancient banyan trees. The air hangs thick with humidity, the scent of river silt, street spices, and something older, something more elusive. Tucked amid the city's colonial architecture, where old fortifications meet modern concrete, lies a near-forgotten corner of Fort William. Here, in a nondescript chamber of stone and iron, begins one of the most infamous and contested tragedies in the history of the British Empire. A small room, a single night, and a death toll that would echo across centuries. This is the story of the Black Hole of Calcutta, and perhaps its lingering curse. On the night of June 20th, 1756, the walls of old Fort William bore witness to a grim episode that would soon become legend. The Nawab of Bengal, Siraj-ud-Dawla, had laid siege to the fort in retaliation against British expansion and the fortification of defenses without his permission. When the British forces surrendered, a group of approximately 146 prisoners, British soldiers, civilians, and their Indian allies, were allegedly forced into a small dungeon no larger than 14 feet by 18. The chamber had only 2 small windows and no ventilation. As dawn broke, only 23 were said to have survived. The account comes primarily from a survivor, John Zephaniah Hallwell, a senior East India Company official, who later published a widely circulated testimony. He described men and women screaming, clawing at the stone, suffocating in the heat, pressed body against body in the dark. His story shocked the British public and became a rallying cry for imperial vengeance. But as decades passed, doubt crept in. Were there truly 146 people crammed into such a small space? Did Hallwell exaggerate or fabricate? No other first-hand accounts were ever found. No official burial site for the dead was located. Even the exact position of the dungeon itself became a matter of dispute. How could such a pivotal, traumatic event fade so quickly into uncertainty? In 1901, the British erected a memorial obelisk in the grounds of St. John's Church in Kolkata, listing the names of those said to have perished. But historians and local scholars question the authenticity of the list. Some names appear to be repeated. Others never existed in any known regimental roles. The site chosen for the monument was also not the original dungeon, but a symbolic location. Was this a case of colonial myth-making? A tale woven to justify conquest and retaliation? Or was something stranger at play? An attempt to bury not just the dead, but the truth itself? Adding to the intrigue, several British officers closely associated with the Black Hole affair and its subsequent memorialization met with untimely or bizarre deaths. John Hallwell himself, though knighted and respected, suffered from paranoia in his later years. He claimed to be plagued by visions of the dungeon, even thousands of miles away in England. Letters from his final years speak of dreams in which the stone walls of Fort William closed in on him. He refused to sleep in rooms without open windows and eventually succumbed to what physicians then called nervous fever. Colonel Robert Clive, who would later avenge the incident by defeating Siraja Dowlah at Plassey, also ended his life in darkness. Though he rose to great power and wealth, Clive suffered from chronic insomnia, depression, and mysterious ailments. He died by suicide in 1774 under ambiguous circumstances. Was it guilt, illness, or, as one later writer described, the spectral price of blood paid in silence? Even the fort itself seems steeped in shadows. Visitors in the early 19th century spoke of inexplicable cold spots near the supposed site of the dungeon. Guards complained of hearing cries at night, gasping, moaning, even the sounds of pounding fists. In 1833, a junior officer stationed at Fort William wrote in his diary, "There is a room in the southern bastion they say is cursed. I laughed, of course, until I went in alone. It felt as though I was being watched, no, pressed upon, as if the very air sought to smother me. I did not sleep that night." The room was later sealed. Local folklore adds another dimension. Among Bengali oral histories, the story of the Black Hole is told quite differently. Some say that the room had always been a site of misfortune, even before the British arrived. One tale speaks of an earlier Mughal commander who used it as a torture chamber and was later found dead within its walls, his body untouched, but his eyes wide with terror. Still others believe that what occurred in 1756 was not merely a political miscalculation or logistical failure, but a spiritual transgression. That the land upon which Fort William was built had once been sacred, and that the suffering within its walls awoke something ancient. Speculative? Certainly. But why does the story still evoke such unease? When India gained independence in 1947, the Black Hole Monument was quietly moved. The original location of the dungeon, already contested, was overtaken by new construction. Today, tourists wander Fort William unaware of the specific location of one of the most symbolically potent tragedies of the colonial era. And perhaps that is fitting. For the mystery now lies not only in what happened that night, but in how it has been remembered, reshaped, and possibly forgotten. What are we to make of an event that rests on a single survivor's account? An incident used to justify an empire's expansion, yet shrouded in factual ambiguity. Were there really 146 people? Was Hallwell telling the truth? Or telling a story? And why do so many who engage with this history, both in Britain and in India, report a strange, heavy feeling when revisiting the site or reading the testimony? Could it be guilt, collective trauma, or something deeper, something that has not been fully understood? The Black Hole of Calcutta endures not only as a symbol of colonial horror, but as a riddle of memory itself. Its very name evokes dread, but the specifics remain as elusive as the shadows in that stifling chamber. Did the empire build its myth on a tragedy, or build the tragedy into myth? And in doing so, what might it have stirred that still lingers in stone, in silence, and in story? Even now, as the walls of Fort William stand beneath the Kolkata sun, one is left to wonder, was the curse real, or was the silence that followed the real curse? As the heat rises over the dusty plains of northern India, the pale walls of long-abandoned palaces shimmer beneath a golden sun. Peacocks wander through overgrown courtyards. Faded portraits, once grand depictions of velvet-draped royalty, hang crooked on cracked walls, their subjects gazing out with unreadable expressions. Here, in the quiet decay of forgotten princely states, lies a silence not just of time, but of disappearance. Disappearance not of empires nor of battles, but of people, of bloodlines, of heirs, of princes who were once promised thrones and simply vanished. During the height of the British Raj, India was a mosaic of more than 500 princely states, each ruled by its own local monarch, but ultimately beholden to the authority of the British crown. While many of these rulers maintained ceremonial power, their positions were crucial in maintaining colonial order. Alliances were forged not only through diplomacy and war, but through intricate arrangements of lineage, loyalty, and succession. But what happens when a prince, an heir to a throne, vanishes without explanation? Throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, scattered records hint at such events. Young rulers or heirs, often educated in England, sometimes return to find their thrones reassigned, their estates absorbed, and their names removed from history. Others simply never returned at all. Were these disappearances tragic accidents, victims of disease or political misfortune? Or were they deliberate acts, quiet removals, orchestrated behind the veils of empire? Take the case of Maharaj Kumar Rajendra Singh of the erstwhile princely state of Kanker, last seen in 1913 aboard a steamer bound for Europe. He had left for what was documented as educational pursuits in Cambridge. A promising young nobleman, his letters to family spoke of enthusiasm, intellect, and a desire to modernize his kingdom. But after one final telegram, sent from London and cryptic in tone, he was never heard from again. British officials declared him lost at sea, citing unconfirmed reports of a maritime accident. Yet no such accident appears in British shipping records of the time. His body was never found. His possessions, strangely, were returned to India months later, carefully packed and unopened, except for his personal journal, which had been removed and was never recovered. Rajendra Singh's younger cousin was quietly installed as ruler. No official inquiry followed. Then there's the case of Prince Faisal Mir of Bhuj, whose existence is known only through a handful of photographs, one arresting portrait in oil, and 2 letters preserved in the India office records. In 1922, Faisal was said to have taken a retreat into the Himalayas for religious reflection, a practice not uncommon among Indian royals seeking spiritual prestige. But what began as pilgrimage ended in a permanent absence. Guides who accompanied him to the outskirts of a monastery in what is now Himachal Pradesh claimed he entered alone and never emerged. Monks at the site denied ever seeing him. Was he murdered? Did he flee his title, his burdens, his colonial overseers? Or was he perhaps entangled in something deeper, something less material and more esoteric? Fragments of his final letter to his sister survive. One haunting line reads, "If I return, I may not return as myself. If I don't, remember I sought the truth." These disappearances weren't isolated. In the archives of the India Office and the National Archives of India, scattered references emerge, each vague, each incomplete. Mentions of succession complications, unresolved custodial matters, or simply status unclear. The British colonial bureaucracy, meticulous in its attention to detail, appears oddly lax in documenting the fates of these young royals. Could the empire have played a role? Some historians argue that the British had every incentive to quietly eliminate or suppress princely heirs who resisted colonial authority. Installing more compliant successors, or abolishing princely seats altogether, simplified governance. In such a tightly controlled political ecosystem, ambition could be dangerous. In 1901, the Viceroy of India, Lord Curzon, wrote in a private letter, "It is sometimes more useful for a state to lose its prince than to suffer his independence." Was that sentiment ever acted upon? More speculative theories have flourished over time. Some claim that certain princes were absorbed into secret intelligence work, either by force or by persuasion. It is known that several members of Indian royalty were recruited by the British for discreet missions, diplomatic, political, even occult. Documents declassified in 1980 reveal the presence of Indian royals in early British espionage circles, including reports of coded letters sent from monasteries in Tibet and Nepal during the lead-up to World War I. Could these disappeared princes have been pawns in a global game that extended far beyond the subcontinent? There are even whispers, though faint, of mystical pursuits. In rare cases, such as Prince Faisal's, spiritual transformation is offered as explanation. A small circle of modern researchers in South Asia suggests that some royal heirs intentionally disappeared into ascetic orders, renouncing worldly power in protest or search for higher knowledge. If true, this would make their silence self-chosen, but still raises the question, why erase all trace of themselves? What would compel a man raised for glory and wealth to dissolve into legend? The families left behind seldom spoke openly. To do so would often mean risking favor, titles, or the safety of remaining kin. In some princely houses, the names of vanished heirs were quietly omitted from official genealogies. In others, they were remembered only in hushed tones, as martyrs or traitors, depending on who was telling the story. A few royal descendants, now living in modern India or abroad, have begun to ask questions. Some have searched archives, consulted aging retainers, and even attempted spiritual pilgrimages to the places last associated with their lost ancestors. In many cases, they have found only more silence. What remains today are puzzle pieces, unconfirmed reports, fragments of correspondence, abandoned palaces, and oil portraits of vanished men. In museums and libraries, you may come across their faces. Look long enough, and you might feel as though they are looking back. The British Empire documented everything. And yet, in these cases, so much is missing. Did these young royals fall prey to disease, accident, or political elimination? Or did they vanish by choice, seeking a freedom that no throne, no empire could offer? And most haunting of all, What truths remain hidden in forgotten attics, sealed archives, and the memories of aging witnesses? The princes disappeared, but their shadows have not. Winds whip endlessly across the bleak, rolling moorlands of the Falkland Islands, this distant corner of the South Atlantic where grass grows in tufts across rocky hills, and silence dominates the horizon. The sky, often a dome of gray, hovers low over the landscape. It's a place that feels timeless, untouched by the hum of modern cities, far removed from the machinery of empire. But in 1982, these lonely islands became the stage for a war both swift and brutal. British and Argentine troops clashed across desolate hills, trenches, and muddy peat fields in a campaign that lasted just 10 weeks, but left behind deep scars, not all of them visible. Among those scars are stories whispered between soldiers and veterans, stories that, even decades later, many refuse to share openly, stories of apparitions. During the height of the Falklands War, as British forces advanced toward Port Stanley, something strange began to circulate among units posted near Mount Longdon, Wireless Ridge, and Goose Green, three key battlegrounds etched in the military memory of the conflict. Several soldiers, often while alone on sentry duty or in isolated foxholes, began reporting the same unnerving sensations: a sudden drop in temperature, the scent of old tobacco, and the echo of boots on frozen turf. Some claimed to see shadowy figures standing silently at the edge of the mist. Others heard whispers, unintelligible yet distinctly human. And then there were those who claimed to see faces from another time. Could these visions have been mere hallucinations? Symptoms of fatigue, stress, and the isolation of war? Perhaps. But the stories persisted and began to converge in uncanny ways. One of the most commonly cited apparitions was described as a group of men in outdated military uniforms not of the 1980s, but resembling those worn by British soldiers during World War I. Soldiers spoke of encountering spectral figures dressed in khaki greatcoats and Brodie helmets, standing silently in the mist, often near the sites of Argentine entrenchments. A Royal Marine sergeant, who later gave a private testimony to a military chaplain, described a night watch near Two Sisters Ridge. "It was just past 3 a.m. I was exhausted, barely keeping my eyes open. Then I saw them. 3 of them standing near the edge of the trench, maybe 30 feet away. I called out. No response. I blinked, and they were gone." The chaplain, who later recorded the testimony in an anonymous log, noted that the soldier was visibly shaken and not known to be superstitious. In fact, this Marine had previously served in Northern Ireland and had never reported anything unusual in his service record. Similar reports were documented by others, including members of the 2nd Battalion, Parachute Regiment, who held positions near Mount Tumbledown. One junior officer recounted hearing a voice, calm but insistent, warning him to stay low just before an artillery shell struck nearby. The voice, he claimed, was not that of a comrade, and he had been alone. What makes these accounts even stranger is the historical dissonance. The Falklands had never been the site of earlier British land battles. There were no World War I trenches here, no recorded ghosts of long-dead battalions. And yet, many of the apparitions described bore the features and equipment of soldiers from a different war entirely. Some local historians suggest a psychological explanation. Perhaps these visions were cultural projections shaped by the deep British military subconscious. In moments of fear or disorientation, might the minds of young soldiers conjure echoes from the past, even if geographically disconnected? Or is there something else at play in the lonely vastness of the Falklands? Among the most compelling legends is what some veterans now refer to as the Guardian on Longdon. According to multiple unconnected testimonies, a figure, described as tall, cloaked, and seemingly unaware of the modern conflict, was seen walking calmly through the battlefield in the early hours of June 12, 1982. This was the final phase of the assault on Mount Longdon, one of the bloodiest encounters of the war. Witnesses claimed that the figure moved against the wind, and in one case, passed through razor wire without so much as a flutter. Several men reported feeling a profound sense of calm or protection in its presence. No photographs were taken. No official records mentioned the incident. And yet, in reunions years later, veterans independently confirmed the story, and even described the same facial features of the mysterious figure. Some whispered that he was a shepherd spirit. Others believed he was the ghost of a British officer from an earlier war, watching over his men in a moment of need. One theory, still mentioned in military folklore circles, suggests he was not of this earth at all. Skeptics, of course, dismiss these accounts. They point to the mental strain of war, the environmental disorientation of the Falklands' rugged terrain, and the foggy, often hallucinatory conditions of sleep-deprived combat. Yet no one has been able to explain the consistency of the reports. The soldiers who saw and heard these things did so at different times, often in different sectors of the islands, without knowledge of the others' experiences. And crucially, many of them kept their stories hidden for years, only coming forward after retirement, some even on their deathbeds. Could it be that the Falklands, for all its strategic and political weight, harbors an unseen history, one that predates the war? There are old maps, rarely studied, which suggest that long before European powers laid claim to the islands, indigenous seafarers from South America may have visited the archipelago. Oral traditions from southern Argentina speak of a land of silence and watching spirits to the east. Could the land itself bear memory or energy? Or might the apparitions be echoes not of the past, but of another reality entirely? Some fringe theorists have posited ideas ranging from time slips to military experimentation. A 2003 Argentine documentary briefly explored claims that both sides encountered environmental anomalies during the conflict, including magnetic distortions and unexplained lights in the sky. These elements, while largely dismissed by formal historians, continue to intrigue researchers of the unexplained. Today, the Falkland Islands stand quiet once more. Sheep outnumber people by nearly 100 to 1. The remnants of war, rusting ordnance, weather-worn trenches, still dot the landscape. But it's the intangible that lingers most. The whispers of soldiers, the chill of a presence, the shadow that should not be there. The official histories will tell you about the strategy, the sacrifice, the swift conclusion of a colonial echo. But between the lines, among the moors and fog banks, something else remains. Were the apparitions merely ghosts of the mind, or visitors from some deeper well of memory, stirred awake by violence and blood? And if they were real, why did they come? And why have they stayed so quiet since? As the red sun begins to dip below the endless horizon, Australia's outback transforms. What was harsh and blistering by day becomes a vast, whispering void of shadows and silence. Wind drifts across rust-colored sands, stirring the dry grass of a place older than recorded time. The landscape is both magnificent and menacing, flat in some places, jagged in others, punctuated by ancient rock formations, salt lakes, and gnarled trees that twist like ghosts rooted in time. Here, in the heart of this ancient land, the line between what is known and what is unknowable has always been razor-thin. Aboriginal peoples have long considered much of the outback sacred, woven with dreamtime stories of spirits, transformations, and cosmic geography. But when the British Empire turned its gaze inland, seeking to map and tame this empty continent, they found far more than they expected, and some never returned at all. Among the strangest and most unsettling chapters in colonial history are the unexplained vanishings, expeditions that disappeared without a trace, men swallowed by a continent vast enough to erase them from history. But what really happened to those who vanished into the Australian interior? And why do the official accounts so often leave behind more questions than answers? Perhaps the most famous case is that of Ludwig Leichhardt, a Prussian-born explorer and naturalist sponsored by the British colonial government. In 1848, he set out from the Darling Downs in Queensland, aiming to cross the continent from east to west, an ambitious and dangerous undertaking. With a small party of men, horses, and pack animals, he journeyed into the vast, unmapped center of the continent. Then, nothing. No message, no sightings, no wreckage, no bones. Leichhardt and his entire party simply vanished into the outback. At the time, theories abounded. Hostile encounters with local Aboriginal groups, poisoned water, mutiny. Expeditions were sent to trace his path, but only a few scattered artifacts ever emerged. Most notably, a brass nameplate believed to be from one of his firearms, discovered decades later near Sturt Creek in Western Australia, far off his assumed route. Even today, no consensus exists. How does an entire group of men with supplies and equipment disappear so thoroughly? Could the harshness of the land alone account for it? Or did they stumble upon something they weren't meant to see? Leichhardt wasn't the only explorer lost in the outback. The Burke and Wills expedition of 1860-61, better documented, but no less tragic, was meant to achieve the first south-to-north crossing of the continent. Funded generously and outfitted with 19 men and dozens of camels and horses, the expedition fell victim to poor planning, harsh conditions, and miscommunication. When Burke and Wills finally reached the northern coast, they found it was the wet season and could go no further. On their return journey, they missed a critical rendezvous point at Cooper Creek by mere hours. Their support party, assuming them dead, had just departed. Weeks later, the two men perished of exhaustion and starvation. But some details surrounding their final days remain murky. One member of the team, John King, survived, rescued by a local Aboriginal group. His account was one of desperation, but it also hinted at decisions made under duress, fragments of journals lost, and moments of profound disorientation. Why, for example, did the party choose such an inhospitable route? And why do some local oral traditions suggest that Burke and Wills encountered something otherworldly? In more recent years, scholars have begun to explore the possibility that these disappearances were not solely the result of misfortune or miscalculation, but of encounters with knowledge and terrain that Western science, even now, struggles to comprehend. Aboriginal elders in several regions have long guarded sacred sites, areas considered taboo for outsiders. Some of these align with locations where explorers reportedly vanished, fell ill, or became lost despite their instruments. Could the land itself, its magnetic anomalies, unpredictable weather systems, or spiritual geography, play a role? Some geologists have identified unusual readings in certain parts of the desert, areas where compasses spin without cause, where animals refuse to tread. Others have pointed to the psychological effects of intense heat, dehydration, and isolation. But those who study the paranormal offer another perspective. A handful of researchers, often dismissed by academia, have suggested that the outback may contain thin places, regions where the boundary between dimensions or times becomes blurred. They cite reports not just from explorers, but from modern travelers who have experienced missing time, strange lights, and even voices in languages no longer spoken. These stories are not always publicized, but they are recorded in personal journals, in whispered conversations at outposts, and in the stories passed quietly between station workers and desert guides. One of the more haunting tales comes not from the 19th century, but from the 1930s. A small surveying team operating near the Tanami Desert radioed in from their remote station, and then went silent. When search parties arrived, they found their camp abandoned. The food and supplies were untouched. There were no signs of violence, no bodies. Only one thing had changed. Every compass in the camp pointed north, except one, which spun in lazy circles endlessly. No official inquiry followed. The file, if one existed, is missing from government archives. Could these stories simply be exaggerated lore, shaped by the Outback's isolation and mythic scale? Or is there something deeper here? A pattern that colonial history, in its haste to document, classify, and conquer, never truly grasped. The British Empire saw Australia's interior as a riddle to be solved, a space to be mapped, tamed, and claimed. Yet to those who knew it best, it was never empty. It was living, breathing, watching. Perhaps the real mystery lies not in what was lost, but in what was ignored. And if so many explorers were lost in this land, why do we still not know exactly where they went or what they found? Was it only hunger and heat that claimed them? Or was it something older? Something the land itself is not ready to reveal? The island of Tasmania, adrift in the Southern Ocean just beyond the mainland edge of Australia, is a realm of fog-draped mountains and dense, whispering forests. Ancient eucalyptus trees lean toward the mist, their bark flaking like parchment, while marsupial shapes flicker through the underbrush. In these quiet corners of the natural world, time seems to pause, waiting, listening. It is here, beneath canopies long undisturbed, that tales of a phantom predator persist, an animal whose very name conjures images of isolation, extinction, and perhaps survival against all odds. The thylacine, or Tasmanian tiger, once roamed freely across the Australian mainland, New Guinea, and later the forests of Tasmania. With its slender, dog-like build, stiff tail, and tiger-striped hindquarters, the creature was unlike anything else. Neither wolf nor cat, but a marsupial predator of a lineage millions of years old. By the time the British Empire turned its attention to Tasmania in the early 1800s, the thylacine was already retreating into the island's deeper wilds, its population dwindling as settlers claimed farmland, introduced sheep, and hunted anything that threatened colonial livestock. The stage was set for a quiet vanishing. But how and why that vanishing happened, and whether it ever truly finished, is a question far stranger than it first appears. The official record tells us the last known thylacine died in captivity in 1936 in the Beaumaris Zoo in Hobart. The animal, often referred to as Benjamin, was found one morning cold and lifeless on the concrete floor of its cage. It had been locked out of its shelter overnight, exposed to the chill of a Tasmanian winter. There was no ceremony, no special note in the newspapers. Only decades later would its death be retroactively seen as the end of a species. But was it? Already by that time, sightings of thylacines in the wild had become rare, but not non-existent. Bushmen, farmers, and even soldiers stationed in remote areas reported fleeting glimpses of striped creatures slipping into the forest, leaving strange paw prints behind in the mud. Some claimed to hear their distinctive yip bark in the night. Most of these stories were dismissed as misidentification, wild dogs, mangy foxes, or tricks of the light in an uncanny landscape. Yet some reports came from experienced trappers and naturalists, people who knew the land and its fauna better than any city official ever could. Why were they so convinced? To understand the mystery of the Tasmanian tiger, one must also understand the nature of extinction itself, how we define it, how we verify it, and how often we presume it. The process of declaring a species extinct requires exhaustive surveying, clear evidence of absence over a prolonged period, and certainty that no viable populations remain. But Tasmania is not easily surrendered to certainty. Its rugged terrain hides entire ecosystems from view. Weather patterns shift quickly, obscuring drones, cameras, and helicopters. Remote plateaus are accessible only by foot, and even then, only in certain seasons. And, as some have noted, the thylacines' behavior, solitary, nocturnal, and shy, makes it uniquely adept at evasion. Could a small population have survived beyond 1936, hidden in the depths of the island? Or had the final thylacine truly passed, unseen and unrecognized in its final moments? During the 1980s and 1990s, the mystery deepened. A wave of sightings, over 4,000 recorded in Tasmania alone, spurred both public fascination and government interest. In 1982, a park ranger in the state's northeast reported observing a striped, dog-like creature for over 3 minutes through binoculars. In 1985, another ranger claimed to have seen a pair of the animals at dusk. In 1995, a German tourist even captured a shaky video that some experts declared inconclusive, while others insisted it was definitive proof. The Tasmanian government quietly launched investigations. None yielded conclusive evidence. No bones, no hair, no scat. Just tracks, just stories, and just enough doubt to keep the door ajar. Then there is the fringe. Those who speak of government cover-ups, of secret colonies protected to avoid public outcry, or of thylacines being smuggled off-island for cloning or experimentation. These theories, while often scoffed at by scientists, raise uncomfortable questions. Why, for instance, were so many museum specimens mislabeled or poorly preserved? Why have private landowners allegedly refused access to surveyors? And why were some credible sightings, particularly from forestry officials and rangers, quietly downplayed or redacted? Is it possible that someone, somewhere, has more knowledge than they've shared? Meanwhile, the story is not confined to Tasmania. On the Australian mainland, sightings have increased in recent decades, despite the thylacine having been extinct there for thousands of years. Wildlife biologists have reported kangaroos fleeing from unseen predators. Unusual tracks appear in dry riverbeds in South Australia and Western Victoria. In 2021, researchers from James Cook University received several credible witness statements and released a preliminary report suggesting the possibility of survival in Cape York. But again, no body, no proof, only shadows. And yet, extinction is not always final. The coelacanth, a fish thought to have vanished alongside the dinosaurs 65 million years ago, was found alive in 1938. The Laotian rock rat was discovered in food markets after being presumed extinct for 11 million years. Could the thylacine be another such Lazarus species? If so, it would not only rewrite the history of Australia's wild places, but challenge our entire understanding of the colonial era's impact on the continent. The extinction of the Tasmanian tiger is often cited as a symbol of imperial exploitation, of careless settlement, ecological destruction, and erasure. But if the tiger lives on, what then? What would it mean for a creature declared lost by the same colonial forces that drove it to the edge, to simply reappear? In the end, the enigma of the Tasmanian tiger is not only about a vanished species. It's about the fragility of knowledge, the gap between what we know and what we assume. It is a mystery built not just from silence, but from the spaces between facts, from tracks that fade, from sounds that vanish in the wind. And so we are left with the questions. Is the thylacine truly gone? Or is it still out there, alive in the shadowy folds of the forest, unseen, unclaimed, waiting? What else, we must ask, remains hidden in the places we thought we had mapped? Beneath a white-hot Sudanese sun, the city of Khartoum lay shrouded in silence. broken only by the faint ripple of the Nile and the hushed prayers drifting from nearby mosques. On the morning of January 26, 1885, the city's narrow alleyways, sun-baked courtyards, and fortified ramparts bore the smoke and scars of a siege now in its final hours. Somewhere within this fractured city, a place where empire and resistance had violently collided, stood General Charles George Gordon, the famed British officer, standing alone at the end of his post. Or so the story goes. But what precisely happened in those last few moments of Gordon's life has never been conclusively known. His death, while widely commemorated in paintings, monuments, and imperial legend, remains disturbingly vague in its details, lost in the confusion of rebellion, the collapse of communication, and perhaps deliberate obfuscation. How could such a prominent figure, arguably one of the British Empire's most celebrated martyrs, disappear from history at the very moment of his death? And why, even today, do we still lack definitive answers? General Gordon, sometimes called Gordon of Khartoum, was a paradox of his time. Both a servant of empire and a deeply religious man who often clashed with authority. Born in 1833, he had risen to fame for his exploits in China during the Taiping Rebellion, and later as Governor-General of the Sudan under the Khedive of Egypt. His reputation was one of iron discipline and moral conviction. To some, he was a hero. To others, a dangerous zealot, guided more by divine mission than political realism. By 1884, the British Empire was embroiled in the Mahdist War in Sudan, a nationalist uprising led by Muhammad Ahmad, who declared himself the Mahdi, the prophesied redeemer of Islam. Khartoum, the strategic center of Anglo-Egyptian control in the region, was under siege. Gordon had been sent to evacuate the city. Instead, he chose to stay and defend it. Why? Some historians argue he saw the situation in messianic terms, that Gordon believed himself chosen to hold the city against impossible odds, trusting in divine providence. Others believe he sought martyrdom, an end befitting a man of mythic proportions. But even those theories leave much unexplained, particularly what happened when the Mahdist forces finally stormed Khartoum. When the city fell on that January morning, Gordon was reportedly killed almost immediately. The most common account, based on second-hand reports, suggests he was speared at the steps of the palace as he calmly awaited death in full dress uniform, Bible in hand. A noble ending, dramatized in Victorian paintings and echoed in imperial rhetoric. But is it true? No British eyewitness saw his death. No body was ever recovered. No confirmed burial site was recorded. Everything we know, every account that exists, comes from Mahdist fighters, contradictory Arabic sources, and later, British retellings. Some say Gordon's head was severed and paraded through the streets of Omdurman, a grisly trophy meant to demoralize British influence. Others claim he was killed in combat, not at the palace, but in the chaotic streets during a final skirmish. Still others whisper of darker possibilities, that Gordon may have taken his own life, or that he was captured and quietly executed later, his death hidden to protect the image of a man who had come to symbolize British resolve. What is fact? What is fabrication? Compounding the mystery is the delayed response of the British relief expedition led by Sir Garnet Wolseley. After months of bureaucratic hesitancy in London, Wolseley's force arrived at Khartoum just 2 days after its fall. Too late to save Gordon, but not too late to witness the aftermath. Why had the relief been so long delayed? Some point to political inertia, others to indifference from Prime Minister Gladstone, who viewed Gordon's religious fervor and defiance as liabilities. There are even theories that suggest Gordon was meant to be sacrificed, a convenient martyr whose death would inflame public opinion and justify future military intervention. Indeed, the reaction in Britain was one of outrage. Gordon became a national symbol, immortalized in statuary and sanctified in story. But amid the praise, a quiet uncertainty lingered. Why were his final communications so cryptic? Why was his strategy so inconsistent, oscillating between preparing for siege and requesting evacuation? And most unsettling of all, why did no definitive account of his death emerge, despite the political capital such an account would provide? Over the years, researchers and historians have returned again and again to Khartoum, hoping to find something: an overlooked letter, a buried journal, a contemporary Sudanese record that might finally resolve the enigma. In 2010, newly examined documents suggested Gordon may have left more detailed instructions for escape than previously believed, suggesting he was not the fatalist his legend portrays. More recently, fringe theories have proposed that Gordon was not killed at all, that he may have been captured and quietly ransomed off, living out his final days in disguise or exile. There is no strong evidence for such claims, and yet they underscore the vacuum that truth often leaves behind. In a war filled with imperial pretense, colonial agendas, and competing national myths, Gordon's death is a puzzle with missing pieces, perhaps deliberately removed. Today, Khartoum has changed dramatically. The grand palace where Gordon is said to have died still stands, though its steps are worn, its gates rusted. The city around it pulses with modern traffic and layered memory. Tourists and historians alike still seek out the spot, imagining the scene of a man defiant before his end. But can we trust the story as it's been told? Is it the truth, or a myth shaped for empire? Was Gordon the noble victim of political betrayal, a martyr for civilization as his admirers insisted, or something else entirely? A symbol of reckless intervention, a man lost in his own prophecy? Or was he something in between, a human being caught in the storm of history, whose last moments remain forever cloaked in silence? Even now, over a century later, the mystery of General Charles Gordon's death endures. And as with so many mysteries of empire, it forces us to confront not just what we know, but what we choose to remember. Who writes the final chapter? And what, if anything, was deliberately left unwritten?